Ever wonder if you're learning the right skills to compete in an AI-driven world? With AI evolving and reshaping development as we know it, it's not about building static cookie-cutter sites anymore. After all, even V0 can do that. But while AI is getting better at cranking out basic code, what it can't do is craft those jaw-dropping interfaces that make people say, wow. That's where you come in. In this course, I'll walk you through how to build and deploy a cutting-edge AI-themed landing page that's so good it'll leave ChatGPT in the dust. By the end of this video, you'll have the skills to create web experiences that no AI can touch. In this evolving tech landscape, you won't just stay relevant, your skills will be indispensable. But don't take my word for it. Let me show you exactly what you'll be capable of creating by the end of this course. Welcome to Spherial, a fully responsive AI-themed landing page designed to capture attention and engage users like never before. Let's take a minute to show you everything you'll create. Starting in the hero section, we'll create a stunning introduction with planets that react to the movement of your cursor. As you scroll down past the hero image, chat bubbles will create a smooth parallax effect that brings the section to life. Below that, the list of companies will animate on and off the screen with an infinite scroll effect that's not only eye-catching, it's mesmerizing. In the features section, we'll surround the site logo with an orbit of different tools that adds visual interest. The pricing section will be enhanced with micro interactions that bring delight to the user experience. We'll bring the testimonials to life with fluid animations, where each one will have a silky smooth entrance and exit, making sure they're noticed and remembered. For the call to action section, we'll mirror the hero by showing planets that react to your cursor as they gracefully glide across the screen. And finally, we'll build a simple, functional footer with working navigation, tying everything together seamlessly. Of course, everything will be fully responsive, ensuring the site looks amazing no matter the device. To bring this futuristic page to life, we're using some of the most powerful cutting-edge tools available. The first is React. It allows us to build interactive components while keeping our code clean and organized. We're supercharging React with Next.js. Think of it as strapping a rocket to an already lightning-fast car. Next.js brings static site generation, giving your site the kind of performance that Google's algorithm loves. None of this would be complete without talking about styling. For this site, we're using TailwindCSS, which is a game changer. Instead of wrestling with CSS for hours, Tailwind lets us style components on the fly without ever leaving our markup. It's like having a coding superpower at our fingertips. On top of that, we're using Framer Motion, the special sauce that allows us to build animations that seem almost magical. But let's not forget about other tools you'll gain experience with in this course, including Typescript, Class Variance Authority, and SVGR. This tech stack isn't just a collection of trendy tools, it's a carefully curated selection designed to give you the edge over AI. By mastering these technologies, you won't just keep up with AI, you'll become a coding machine so good you'll make even Claude green with envy. Now, if you're feeling overwhelmed, don't worry. Not only will I guide you every step of the way, but I'll also be providing everything you need to get started for free by clicking the link in the description. When you click that link, you'll get a treasure trove of free resources designed to help you complete this project. You'll get the fully responsive designs showing you in pixel perfect detail what to build. You'll also get the starter template so you can hit the ground running with a pre-configured setup. On top of that, you'll have access to every image and icon used in the course to help your project truly shine. Everything you need is right there, free of charge. So are you ready to transform your skills, supercharge your portfolio, and take a giant leap forward in your career? We're going to do all of that in this course. Without further ado, let's code. In order to get started with this project, all we need to do is take our template folder that we downloaded from the link in the description and drop it into our IDE. I'm using Cursor here, but VS Code would work very well as well. After you've done that, go ahead and open up the terminal, and what you want to run is npm install in order to get the project to install all of the dependencies that are required in order for us to run this project. After just a couple of seconds, we can see that the node modules folder is in place, which means our dependencies are installed, and now we can dive into the project. First, let's take a look at what we're going to build inside of our navigation. So you can see up here, we have a logo alongside some text for our Spherial.ai logo. And then we also have this nav button that's going to open a navigation that we are also going to build alongside this header. Over in our tablet view, you can see it's the same thing, just a little bit wider. So you have the logo and the navigation button that are justified between, so where they're just separated by as much space as there is on that particular page. And then over in the desktop view, then we get into having a middle navigation. So you have the logo, the middle nav, and a couple of buttons on the right for login and sign up. So we're going to make sure that we can appropriately style these buttons and the navigation here in the middle, and of course the logo itself. With that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the code. Over in our code, let's open up our source directory and go into our sections directory and come and find our header.tsx file. This is the file that we're going to be working on for this particular section. We can see that it has a couple of nav items. These are going to be the center nav items that we're going to show on the desktop view. You can also see that it has a couple of login items. We're also going to show these on the desktop view, and we're going to put these together in the mobile navigation when we open that navigation up. But for now, we don't need to worry about these items yet because we just need to build out the mobile header first. Down in our actual function, you can see it's just simply returning a header section along with the words header section. And of course, we're exporting the default component here. So in order to get this linked up into our page, we need to come into our app/page.tsx and we need to import it into this file. So I'm going to come up to the top of my file. I'm going to say import header from @section/header, and then I can just simply drop this in place of our hello world right now. I am going to put a React fragment around it, so I'm going to go ahead and toss in that React fragment, and then inside of that, I'm going to drop in my header component and hit save. As long as I've done that and we have everything hooked up, we should see header section now showing up inside of our browser, which I do, which means that we can now close out our page.tsx and come back to our header.tsx and work within this file. First, let's go ahead and make sure that our content is inside this section. So I'm going to remove the words header section, come inside of that and create a div with a class name of container. And then inside that div, we're going to have our content container. So I'm just going to create a div for that. And we're going to have a container to hold our left content, a container to hold our middle navigation eventually, and a container to hold our right content. Inside of our left content container, let's go ahead and add a placeholder for our logo. I'm just going to create an empty div for now because we need to bring in that image. And then beside that, we're going to have some sort of div that's going to hold our sphereal.ai text. And then in our navigation container, we can see as we look at the design, that's going to be a button, and that button is going to have a couple of lines inside of it. So I'm going to go ahead and create a couple of divs for those. But as far as the actual content of this section in the mobile header, I think this is pretty much it for now. Let's go ahead and save that and see what it's looking like. So far, we only have our sphereal.ai showing up, so we need to add some styles in order to get this to look correct. So I'm actually going to pull out my browser window a little bit so that we can see both the design and our code side by side, and I'm going to close down my primary sidebar so that we can just focus on the code for this section. In my header, I'm going to go ahead and give this a class name that's going to have a bottom border. So we're going to say border B, and then we're going to say border gray 200/20. That's going to give us that correct color for our bottom border. We're going to allow our content to set a little bit of the height of this. So I'm going to come into my content div, go ahead and give this a class name as well, and say that it is going to be H18 to set it to a height of 72 pixels. We also want to flex this container. So I'm going to say flex. We're going to align our items to the center. So I'm going to say items center, and that should put our sphereal.ai in the center of the page. For our actual text, let's go ahead and give that a class name as well. And that's going to be font extra bold as well as text 2XL to set the font size correctly. And that should take care of our logo text. Now our logo itself is going to take a little bit more work because it uses a technique called a conic gradient. A conic gradient is essentially a gradient that instead of going from left to right or from top to bottom, it goes in a circular fashion. So let me go ahead and show you what I mean just by adding a class name here. And we're just going to experiment with what we're going to do in order to get our logo to show up correctly. So the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and create a square here. I'm going to make it a size of 40 pixels by saying size 10, and that's going to give it a height and width of 40 pixels. And of course, we're going to want to show these side by side. So I'm going to give this wrapping container a class name as well. That's going to be flexed, and we're going to give it a gap of 4 along with items center to ensure that these show up aligned to the center of each other. Now for this size 10 square, in order for us to see this, I'm going to just go ahead and give this a background of gray 200 just so we can see where this is at. Now for this logo, we actually use 4 different colors. So we use an amber color, a teal color, violet, and fuchsia in order to get this to show up. And we know that using Tailwind CSS, we can do linear gradients. So if I wanted a linear gradient, I could do something like this where I said BG gradient to right, and then we could say from amber 300 to fuchsia 400, and that's going to give us a gradient that shows up from left to right. But if we want a gradient in a circular pattern, this gets a little bit more difficult. So in order to do that kind of gradient, we need to go ahead and give this a custom background. So that's what I'm going to do just by adding these brackets here. And then I'm going to say BG conic gradient, and then we can have some colors added here. So let's go ahead and experiment with this. I'm going to go ahead and just give this a couple colors like red, green, and blue just to see how this conic gradient is going to show up. And as you can see, it actually starts at the top with our red, and then it goes around, transitions down to green at the bottom, and then it ends with blue at 100%. So you can think of this as red at 0%, green at 50% through, and then blue at 100%. Now for our particular gradient, we are actually starting not in the top, but in one of the corners. So we want to rotate this a little bit, and conic gradient allows us to do this just by simply adding a from direction. So if I wanted to start this instead of at 0 degrees straight up, if I wanted to start this from 45 degrees, I could say from 45 degrees. And that's going to turn our conic gradient a little bit and start it from that 45-degree angle. That's perfect for us. Now, inside of this custom gradient, we don't have a good way to get Tailwind colors, and I'd rather not grab those colors and write them in manually. I'd rather have a way to enable us to use those colors with CSS custom properties. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into my files, into my globals.css, and you can see that we just have our Tailwind base components and utilities here that's loading Tailwind CSS, but we can add custom properties in here or CSS variables in order to allow us to use those inside of our file. So I'm going to do exactly that. I'm going to create a layer base, and this is basically just going to load in when CSS loads, and I'm going to say root. Now root is a special selector that basically says that this is going to be available no matter if this is an SVG or HTML document. This is always going to be available. And then inside of here, I can go ahead and add in some custom properties. So I'm going to add in my different colors that I'm going to use inside this gradient. We're going to start with violet 400. So I'm going to add in a color violet 400. That's going to be the name of the variable. And then I'm going to use a special function that Tailwind CSS gives us called theme. And we can actually access a lot of the different properties within Tailwind CSS just by using this theme. So I'm going to pull out theme. I'm going to tell it to give me colors.violet.400, and that should give me the violet 400 color and apply it to this CSS custom property, which is super helpful. Let's do that with the other colors that we're going to use within this gradient. Another one is that fuchsia, so I'm going to say color fuchsia 400, and we're going to say theme colors.fuchsia.400, and let's do the same thing with our amber. So color amber 300 is going to be theme colors.amber.300. And then for the last one, it's going to be color teal 300, and that's going to be theme colors.teal.300. So that should give us these colors that now we can use as custom properties inside of our header. So after I save this, I'm going to come back into my header.tsx, close out my sidebar again so I have a little bit more room to work with. I also want to go ahead and change this to word wrap. So I'm going to say toggle word wrap, and that's going to allow that to show up. And then I can start to use some of these colors. So we know we're going to start from our violet 400. So I'm going to say var color violet 400, and that should start it at that violet 400, which of course it does. That's great. So continuing with that pattern, let's say var -- color fuchsia 400. For the third one, I'm going to say var dash dash color amber 300. For the fourth one, let's go ahead and add a comma after that and say var dash dash color teal 300. And in order to complete the conic gradient back where we started, we're going to end with the color we started with. So that's going to be var dash dash color violet 400. And I'm going to hit save and see if that creates the gradient that we want. Now that is a perfect gradient, but now we need to figure out how do we get the logo to have the gradient as a background rather than just this square having this gradient. And that's actually not hard. We're actually just going to mask this square with our logo to ensure that we show the logo instead of the square. So I'm going to come up to the top. I'm going to go ahead and import my logo. So I'm going to import logo image from @/assets/images/sphereal-logo.svg. And I'm actually going to use a specific technique where I'm going to say question URL. So the reason I'm using that there is because instead of having the SVG as a React component like we want to load sometimes, in this case, we actually just want to get the source height, width, things like that. So SVGR enables this functionality where if we say question URL, we actually get the source of the logo image itself instead of a React component, which is exactly what I want in this case. So let's come back down to our div here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say style equals, and we're going to say mask image, and we're going to give this a JavaScript interpolated string, and we can say logo image dot source, and that should mask our square with this logo image if it works correctly. So let's see if that actually worked. I'm going to go refresh my page and see if we see a masked image. And we're not, just because I see that I made a little bit of a mistake, we needed to put a URL. So we needed to say the URL and then drop the URL inside of that. So let me go ahead and save that again and see if we see a masked image. Now we do, but the image is not the right size. The image is actually too big. So we can control this as well, similarly to how we control a background image by saying mask size, and then we can just say contain and hit save again. And that contains our mask size to the 40 pixel size that we're working with here. And that is how we show a logo with a background gradient the way that we want. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and move on to our navigation button. So this is this button right here. And of course we have these couple of divs. The first thing we want to do is make sure it's the right size. So I'm going to say class name on our button itself and say size 10. We also want to make sure that it has a border radius, so rounded large. We want this to have a border of 2 pixels, so I'm going to say border 2 here. And it is going to hold our nav lines here that we're going to use for this button. So I'm going to say relative in order to make sure that we can position those absolutely. We can see that this isn't split from our logo because we didn't justify between in our flex container. So I'm going to add justify between to our flex container, and that should ensure that our navigation button is split apart from our logo. Now, of course, a great looking button with a border like this isn't necessarily easy to create. This is going to take a special technique as well. We're going to use another conic gradient for this. And before we get to our button border, let's go ahead and style up our hamburger menu lines. So I'm going to come into my first div here. I'm going to go ahead and give this a class name of width 16 or 4, h 0.5 for 2 pixels. We want the background to be BG gray 100. And let me go ahead and save that and see how that shows up. That does look like the line is correct. So let me create another one of these with div class name equals width 4, h 0.5, and BG gray 100. Now to put these in the right spot inside of this button that we know is 40 by 40, and just to be able to see this, I'm going to go ahead and add on a border 2 just so we can see where that button is. I'm going to go ahead and wrap both of these in absolute divs. I'm going to give this first one a div class name equals absolute, and go ahead and wrap that in that div. And then the second one's also going to be wrapped in a div, same way, div class name equals absolute, and that should ensure that we can position these absolutely. Now we want to position these towards the center, and then we'll translate them using transform up and down. So to position them in the center, we're going to say top 1/2, left 1/2, and then negative translate x 1/2, negative translate y 1/2, and that will ensure that our line is positioned in the center. And then for the second one, we're going to add the same exact class. I'm just going to copy and paste this into where I had my absolute position div, and then we should have 2 lines that are on top of each other. Now, to get these moved to the right spot, then we can come down into each of our lines and ensure that we can just translate those in the Y direction. So my first one, I'm going to say negative translate Y1. That'll move it up by 4 pixels. And then the second one, I'm going to say translate Y1. That'll move it down by 4 pixels. And you can see that that creates those two lines. Now that we've done that, let's talk about how we're going to create the border for this particular button. So I'm going to come in here and I'm actually going to give this a custom background. And this is going to be a stack of 2 gradients. So in order to see the first one, let's just go ahead and create a dummy gradient. I'm going to say linear gradient, and we're going to go from red to red and save that and see if we see that gradient on the page. And indeed we do. For the second gradient, we're going to add our conic gradient to it. So I'm going to add a comma here, and I'm going to copy and paste the conic gradient that we've already created up here in the logo, and just go ahead and paste it right here inside of our custom background and hit save. Now we don't see anything yet, and part of that is because of how this background is working. So for this background, it's working, but then it goes right up to our border, which we've created. Let's see what happens if we add a transparent border. So I'm going to say border transparent, and that should allow us to have a transparent border. But now we have the red color going all the way up to that border. So in order to constrain our inside gradient inside this button, I'm going to go ahead and say content box after my first gradient, and that should constrain my gradient just to the content and not allow it to go all the way up to the border. And then for my conic gradient, that can go all the way out to the border because I haven't constrained that one. So this is essentially how we're going to create this gradient border that we see. The only difference is we don't want this interior to be red. We want it to be the background color that we have for our page. So let's open up our sidebar real quick and go to our globals.css and go ahead and add a custom variable in this file that will allow us to access the background color of our page. So I'm going to give this a color gray 950, and we're going to make that equal to the theme function with colors.gray.950, and that will ensure that we have that color available for us to use as a custom property. And then when we come back to our header.tsx, instead of red, now I'm going to give this custom value of var -- color gray 950 to var -- color gray 950 and hit save. Now that's essentially just sticking the background color of the page as the content gradient. So when it transitions from one color to the same color, that's just going to make it a solid color, and that's constrained to the content box. And then around that, we have another gradient that we're layering on the bottom, and that's a conic gradient that we created for our logo. So you can see that creates that amazing gradient that we see. Now, for some reason, I am seeing that this has too many colors. So I'm seeing this conic gradient is going from our 45 degrees and all of that, but maybe we just actually need to constrain this to the border in order for this to show up correctly. So let me see where the end of this conic gradient is. It looks like it's right here. Let me add in border box here and see if that gradient shows up correctly. And indeed it does. So this basically constrains it to the border of our button. That's exactly what we needed to happen. And it looks like that made the styles align correctly. Now that things look good in the mobile view, let's go ahead and overlay our reference image just to ensure that everything looks as it should. So I'm going to go ahead and create this and say overlaid and see if we see any differences. It does look like for some reason this div over here is a little bit different than it was in our reference image. So let's go ahead and make sure that it's centered in our navigation. So I'm going to say div class name here. I'm going to say flex items center and see if that lines up our navigation properly. And indeed it does, which means that that's what we are missing in our navigation. Now that that looks good on mobile, let's take a look at what our tablet view looks like. So I'm going to stretch this out a little bit and take a look at our tablet versus our design. Everything looks right, but in order to ensure that it is right, I'm going to also overlay my reference image on top and see if we see any differences here. And I don't, which means I'm happy with where the tablet header is so far. So let's go ahead and move on to the desktop view. Stretching out my browser as much as possible. Let me go ahead and see what this looks like. And of course, at this side, we are going to notice some changes in our header. So we can see that we start using this middle navigation section. And instead of a mobile navigation hamburger button here, we now have two actual buttons that we've created to the right of our header. So we need to ensure that this code is right for this section. So I'm going to slide my browser back over, and we're going to use this as a reference. I'm just going to slide over what we need, hopefully to use it as a reference as we're creating our content for this section. So we know that inside of our div here, we are going to be creating some nav items. We do have a nav item array up top. So these would be these nav items right here. So we're going to use these in order to create the items that we see here. So I'm going to come inside of my div, and I'm going to make sure we have another div so that we can flex these if we need to. And then inside of that, I'm going to create a semantic navigation tag, and then we're going to put our 4 nav items inside of that. So these are going to be links. So I'm going to take my nav items, I'm going to say dot map, and for each of those items, we're going to have a function that returns some JSX. That will most likely be a link. So I'm going to say href equals, just go ahead and give that a placeholder. And of course, for each of those items, if I scroll up, we can see that we have a name and an href. So I'm going to grab both of those, destructure these from these nav items. So I'm going to say name and href here, and then I'm going to use those inside here. So I'm going to drop the name in here, and I'm going to drop the href inside of my href prop like so. We also need a key, so that's probably going to be the href as well. So I'm going to say key equals href. That will make sure that React is happy with our code. So let me scroll back over and let's take a peek at what we have in our navigation. We can see that doesn't quite look right. So let's add some classes here to go ahead and style these up as well. So for each of these items, I'm going to go ahead and add a class name, and these are going to have 40 pixels of padding left and right. So I'm going to say px10. These are also going to be relative so that we can add the little absolutely positioned ticks that we need to add to the top. So if you take a look at here, we have just these little, it's barely visible here, but there are little ticks that come up that separate these items as well. So we're going to add those on as well. So those are going to be before and after attributes that we add, but let's go ahead and make sure that our text is the right style before we do that. So I'm going to add a class of font bold. We're going to also say text extra small to make sure it's the right size. We're going to say tracking widest to control the letter spacing. And then we'll say text gray 400 to control the color. We also want to make sure we have these uppercase. So I'm going to say uppercase, and that'll ensure that they are transformed to uppercase. Now, in order to make sure that these are the full height of the nav bar, we're also going to have to go ahead and make sure that they are h full to make sure that they're the full height. And then we'll have to do that all the way up the chain because Flexbox is going to push these in if we don't. So I'm going to say class name here of h full. And I think this div is a little bit extraneous. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that div on the top and bottom, this wrapper here. But this div is definitely not. So I'm going to give this a class name of h full as well. And that should ensure that it is the full height. Now that we've done that, we can see that now our nav items are the full height, but now they're not aligning towards the center. So we can probably just go ahead and say inline flex for each of these. And let's see if that does the trick. If we say items center, and it looks like that takes care of that problem. Now to create our little ticks between these nav items, let me go ahead and create these with before and after elements. I'm going to say before content and an empty string. That should ensure that it can show up. I'm going to say before absolute. I'm going to say before bottom 0 to make sure it's aligned to the bottom. We also want it to be the right height. So I'm going to say before h2 and the right width, before width px just to make it 1 pixel. And we'll set it to the right background color by saying before bg gray 200/20, and that'll set it to that border color. Now you can kind of faintly see that those tick marks are showing up. They're not quite the right position though. So I'm going to say before left 0, and that should make sure that they're showing up to the left of each of our nav items, and that looks like they're in the right position. Now we have each of these tick marks showing up before each of our nav items, but we need one more showing up at the very end. So what we can do is go ahead and add an after element here that essentially mimics what we've done with our before. Make sure that instead of left 0, we say right 0, and that should hopefully add that to the end, but it'll add it to the end of each one. So we'll need to just ensure that it only happens for the last item. So let's go ahead and copy what we have for all of our before styles and go ahead and paste those in. And then for each of those, I'm just going to use some IDE trickery to change before to after for the styles that we just pasted. And I'm going to go ahead and hit save. Now, these are positioned on top of what we currently have, and that's because they're currently positioned to left 0. So I'm going to say right 0 for these and then hit save again. Then to ensure that this only shows up for our last item, I'm going to say after hidden. And then in order to get this to show up for our last child, I'm going to say last after block and see if that shows it for our last child. So it looks like I am seeing that tick on our last child, which I believe means that these are hidden except for the very last one where it is shown. The other way I could have done this was to go ahead and create just the content, because this ensures that our after element can actually show on the page this content with an empty string. So I could have set that instead of this rule, and I actually like that better. So I'm just going to go ahead and back to that and say last after content and just ensure that that content doesn't show up unless it is the last item in all of our items. And then of course I can remove this after hidden, then that will ensure that it can show up as well. Now let me go ahead and pull up my browser again and see what the other differences are. So as I take a closer look at this navigation, it does still look like we are seeing the after element show up for all of our nav items, which seems to be due to how Tailwind CSS works. So in order to get this to make sure that this only shows up for my last item, instead of saying this right here, in fact, I don't even actually need this rule because of the way Tailwind CSS is kind of filling in that content for me, but I'm going to take all of my after rules and just apply them to the last child. So I'm going to go ahead and select those all. That's Command D on the Mac. And I'm going to say last after, and that should ensure that this only really happens for my last child or the last nav item. Now I'm only seeing the one line in between, which makes me a lot happier with how those little tick marks are showing up, which means that we can move on to our buttons on the right-hand side of this navigation. So let me pull out my browser again so we can take another look at these buttons. We can see that there's a login button and a sign up button. And we can see that that sign up button does have the same conic gradient that we've already created for our hamburger menu button. So we can use that same code to create this button here as well. And then this one is also a button that has a different background color. So as we're looking at our design, we actually have 3 types of buttons on the page. We have a primary button, which we see right here. We have a secondary button, which has a background color of white. And we have this tertiary button that has this just light gray background color. Since we are going to be using buttons throughout the page, this is probably a great opportunity for us to start creating a button component and then dropping the button component wherever we have a button. So when we get to this button part, I am going to create a component, and then we'll have our primary, our secondary, and our tertiary styling for those buttons. So let me go ahead and pull back my browser, come back to my code, and talk about how we're going to implement those buttons instead of our hamburger menu icon. So we know that inside of our header, we have a container and we have essentially 3 flexed divs. So we have our logo div, we have our navigation div, and we have the div that currently holds our navigation hamburger menu button. Now we could come in here and basically hide this and then show our 2 buttons over here in the right. But I think what would be a little bit easier is actually if we created a 4th div. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to create a 4th div, and we're going to say that this one is hidden by default. So I'm going to give it a class name of hidden and save that. And then at some size, it's going to show up. So at the large size, then we're probably going to go ahead and style this as flex instead of hidden. The same is true for this current flex div that we have here at the large size. Then we'll just hide this one, and that'll ensure that we switch over to using this div right here, which we're currently doing. Inside of here, we know there are 2 buttons. We have one button that says log in, and we have another button that says sign up. And those 2 buttons are the ones that we're going to create components out of. So I'm going to come into my sidebar, go into my components directory, and we're going to create a new file here called button.tsx. It's going to be the first component that we're going to create for this project. In order to export this button, I'm going to say export const button, and that's going to be a function that's going to return some JSX. And for now, we'll just return a button tag with the text of button. After I've saved that, I'm going to come back into my header, and I'm going to replace my usage of button with the button component that I just created. So I'm going to come into my top, I'm going to say import button from @/components/button, and that should ensure that I can use my button. And then I'm going to replace my 2 button tags with my new button component. So I'm going to say button here and end button. And for my other one, I'm going to say button here and end button as well. Now we know for these buttons, we'd like to be able to tell the button which variant to show. So for this one, I'm going to want to say variant equals tertiary because we already talked about this being our tertiary button variant. And the second one, my sign up button, we're going to want to say variant equals primary because we're going to want to be able to use a primary prop for that. Now we're going to go ahead and fill in our component code to allow us to use these variants, but just want to go ahead and fill this in inside of our header code so that we could see the changes as we were creating our button components themselves. So coming back to our button.tsx, let's talk about the different things we're going to need to create in order for this to happen. Inside of this component, I'm going to use something you may not have heard of called Class Variance Authority. So I'm going to import that, and then I'm going to talk about how we're going to use Class Variance Authority in order to help us create better component variants. Now, if you've never heard of Class Variance Authority, let me show you very quickly inside of our bottom browser here exactly what Class Variance Authority is and how it gives us a powerful tool for creating variants and things like that inside of our components. So Class Variance Authority is a tool that essentially allows you to add classes, especially TailwindCSS classes. So it's perfect for the technology stack that we're using. But what it does is it basically allows you to say for a component that you can give it some default class names. And then if you have different variants, you can tell Class Variance Authority which variants you have and what styles to apply if those particular props are selected. So in this case, we have an intent prop, and that has options of primary or secondary. So these class names get added if intent equals primary, and then if intent equals secondary. And we also have a size prop that could be equal to small or medium, and those classes get added there as well if those props are selected. We also have compound variants. We won't be using this, but that is definitely adds a lot more power to this tool. And then we have defaults. So it allows us to go ahead and set what the default settings should be on our component to ensure that we're adding the right classes by default. But then if other props tell us to use different classes, it's going to use those instead. So now that you have that brief overview, let's look at how we're going to actually install this in our project. So I'm going to go ahead and actually copy this right here because this is helpful. And we're going to change this so that we can use it the way that we want to use it for this particular button. So inside of here, we actually want this prop to be named variant. And we are going to have a primary, we're going to have a secondary, we are actually going to have a tertiary variant as well, and we're just going to tell that to be an empty string. And in fact, for each of these, I'm going to add TailwindCSS classes as strings instead of an array of classes, because of course it says that we can do it that way as well, and that's just a little bit easier and faster in my mind. So we have the three variants that we're going to have, and for now I'm not going to have any other variants here. I'm also going to go ahead and remove my compound variants because we're not going to need those for now, and I want to go ahead and set my default variants. So my default variant is going to be equal to primary, and since we don't have a size in this case, I'm going to go ahead and remove that as well. So essentially what this is saying is that these right here are the classes that we're adding by default. I'm actually going to go ahead and change that to an empty string as well. These are the classes we're going to be adding for each of our variants. And then the default is going to be this primary variant. And it's going to give us a function. In this case, it's called button. Now that's called button here in the code that I pasted, but I'm just going to call this classes because I like how that sounds a little bit better. In order to wire this up inside of our component, we need to take in some props. And we need to make sure that the right props are being used for this component. So we're going to have, of course, a variant prop. And the variant could be primary or secondary or tertiary. And we're also going to take in anything that we can use normally for an HTML button element. And that HTML attribute should come from React. So let me go ahead and import that at the top of my file. Import HTML attributes from React. And let's use that HTML attributes here. And now that we've set up what the type of our props can be, let's go into our button and actually use them. So I'm going to say class name equals, and this is where we're actually going to use our classes function. And that classes function is just going to take in our props that we've defined. Now, one of the things that CVA really doesn't like is an empty class name. And that's something that's defined with inside of HTML attributes. So I need to come in here and say const class name, and it's going to be an empty string by default. And then I'll go ahead and spread my other props here as well. And I'm going to make this equal to props. So we just destructured class name out of props, and then we can just stick in ... other props. and of course our class name as well. And that'll ensure that we have an empty string or something by default rather than undefined. For some reason, CVA really doesn't like that. And now that we've installed that, we should be able to just add our classes into our Class Variance Authority and see our buttons start to take shape based on what we add inside of here. So we're going to add some default classes. These are going to be the classes that apply to every single button. So one of those is going to be text extra small to make the text extra small. We're also going to say tracking widest. We want to say uppercase to make sure that the text is transformed correctly. Font bold is going to be the font weight. We want these to be 40 pixels tall, so I'm going to say H10, and then we're going to give this padding of PX6 for 24 pixels left and right. And then after we save that, let's go ahead and style up our tertiary one because this is going to be the easiest. This is just going to be BG gray 800, and then the text color is going to be text gray 200 to ensure that's the right color. We also want to make sure that we have border radius on this. I'm not seeing that yet, so I'm going to come back up to my default and say rounded large, and that'll ensure that the right border radius is added. Now for this button component, since the tertiary prop is what we passed in, it's using basically these default classes alongside these classes right here in order to style that. Now for my primary button, I don't have any custom classes added for that one yet. We need to add our conic gradient to that in the same way that we created our mobile hamburger menu button. So let me go back to my mobile hamburger menu button and see how we created that. We have this border 2, we have border transparent, and we have these classes right here as well. So what I can do is just go ahead and copy these classes, come back to my button.tsx and drop them into my primary button to make sure that if it's primary, it has a border 2, border transparent, and all the things that we said that it should have inside of our primary button. Now what I can see is there is a slight problem with how we've created our linear gradient inside because it's constrained to the content box. Well, what's out here is actually the padding box. So let's go ahead and change content box for this particular case to padding box. And let's see if that allows our interior gradient to overlay our conic gradient for our border. And it does look like it does. So let me go ahead and save this. Now, before we overlay our design and see if there's any differences, I'd like to come back into my header and just make a couple slight adjustments to my button. We know that these are flex, but right now there's no gap in between these. So let me go ahead and add that in real quick. I'm just going to say gap 4, and hopefully that should add the gap in between those. And the other thing that I saw inside of our header is that we have login items right here, but we're not using these login items in order to create our buttons. Instead, we're just manually creating them. I'd like to go ahead and implement that map as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and drop in my login items. So I'm gonna say login items.map. And for each of those items, we're going to have a function that returns some JSX. We're going to destructure our button variant, our name, and our href from each of those items. And then we're going to use that to create our button component with a variant of the one we passed in, button variant. We also want to make sure that the name is showing up in the center. And it looks like we also can wrap each of these in a link. So let's see if we can do that by just going ahead and wrapping these in a link. And we'll set this href prop to the href that's being passed in here. And we also want a key of name. And that should make React happy. Now, the one thing it doesn't like right here is that this variant is supposed to be either primary, secondary, or tertiary, but this button variant that we're passing in, if you look at the type, is actually a string. It's a little bit weird. It's a quirk of Typescript, but essentially when we create an array like this, these don't get typed as what the values could be. It actually just automatically types these as strings. So in order to solve that problem, what we can basically do is just tell Typescript that this needs to satisfy an object type that we give it, and that's going to be an array of those objects. So for name, of course, we can say string. For href, of course, we can say string for that as well. The third one is going to be the button variant. And in order to do that, we could go ahead and give this exactly the same type that we use for our button. But what I'd rather do is export that from the button itself so that if we ever change the type inside of there, then we can use that elsewhere as well. So let me go ahead and come back to my button and let's go ahead and export these props. So I'm going to create a type of button props, and that's going to be equal to exactly the type that we've used down here. So I'm going to just cut and paste that up here. And I'm going to replace what we had down here with button props. So that should be fine. But now this allows us to also export this type. So I can export it, and that means I can import it into my header and use that type. So I'm going to import button and button props. So I can import that and button props, and then I can use that down here to say that the button variant should be defined as button props variant, and that will ensure that TypeScript is happy with these login items. And as I scroll down, you can see that now it's happy with this because now it's not typed as a string, it's typed as one of 3 variants. After I save that, I do see that I have 4 buttons instead of just 2. So let me go ahead and remove the ones that I declared without the array and save those. And it does look like now we're just down to our 2 buttons. One minor difference I'm also noticing as I'm looking at these is they're slightly different heights. So it looks like when we go to the large size, we need to ensure that it's the right height with height 20 instead of height 18. And that should ensure that we're right there. Now that we've done that, let me pull out my browser window. Let's go ahead over here and overlay our reference image and see if there's any problems with the code that we've created. And there's definitely one problem that I'm noticing. Let me pull over my reference image so we can talk about this problem really quickly. You can see that over in our design, we have the words login and sign up in our buttons, but over here we have the word button and button again. So it looks like we're not enabling our button component to actually pass through any text. We definitely need to ensure that that is corrected. So let me go ahead and just take a peek at our button and go back to our button component and ensure that we allow this button text to be passed through. You can see that we have a static text of button. That's not what we want for sure. So let me go ahead and destructure children, which is how we pull the content of React component out within React. And then I'm going to use children right in here by going ahead and dropping it inside of brackets. And hopefully that will allow us to have the correct text within our buttons. That may take care of our issue. So let's go ahead and once again pull out our browser window, overlay our reference image, and see if there's any other problems that we need to deal with. And as I pull out my browser window, I can see that now we have this aligned to a pixel perfect state. So our desktop navigation looks great. Everything is aligned. Let me go ahead and pull my reference image back out to the side so that we can see this desktop navigation. I can see everything looks great on the desktop size. Now, the only thing I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to pull in my browser window again, but I'm going to go back and ensure that we didn't break anything on any of their views. And unfortunately, in our tablet view, it does look like we have our middle navigation added in here as well. That definitely shouldn't be showing up at that size. So let me go back into my header and ensure that we make sure that that middle navigation is not showing up when we are in our tablet view. So before that was showing up, but it was empty. Now that we added content in there, now we need to make sure that it's hidden until we get to the desktop size. So I'm going to give this a class of hidden, and then at the large size, we can then say block, and that should ensure that it shows up at the desktop size. So let's ensure that by just going and scrolling back over to our desktop view, and we can see that that middle navigation is still showing up at that size. And then on our mobile navigation, now that that's hidden at that size as well, that it should ensure that everything shows up as it should. The last thing we're going to do with this navigation is ensure that our mobile nav can actually show when we click our navigation button. So in order to do that, we're going to have something to save the state of whether our mobile nav is open or closed. And that's going to be with React useState. In Next.js, in order to use useState, we need to set a client directive at the top of our file. So I'm going to have to come up to the top of our header.tsx and say use client, and that should ensure that we have that client directive at the top of our file. Then we can come into the body of our component and say const is mobile nav open and set is mobile nav open, and that's going to be equal to use state from React with a default value of false. Now I need to import this value, so I'm going to come to the top of my file as well. I'm going to say import use state from React, and that should ensure that the use state is brought in so that I can use it. And then I have this value here, and I have a setter function as well. Now, every time we click our button, this mobile navigation button, this hamburger button here, we want this value here to change. So I want to go ahead and create that link by coming to my button and going ahead and adding an on-click handler. So we're going to give this an on-click handler, And then that onClick handler is going to take a function that is going to set is mobile nav open to the opposite of whatever it currently is. So I'm going to say cur to not cur. And that essentially will take whatever that latest value is and it will return the opposite of that value. So if it's true, that's going to return not true or false. And if it's false, it's going to return not false or true. So that's what is going to happen there. Now, whenever the mobile nav is open, we want this mobile nav, this hamburger button here, to show an X instead of our normal hamburger 2 lines. So in order to get that to happen, we need to change our translation of our lines to form an X instead of a hamburger menu icon. That's not that hard to do. Let me go ahead and import Tailwind Merge because we can use Tailwind Merge to change our classes based on the state of our component. So I'm going to import TW Merge from Tailwind Merge, and that will allow us to use the TW Merge function down inside of our button. So inside of our button, I'm going to take this div right here, which is our top hamburger menu navigation icon, and I'm going to wrap the class name with a Tailwind Merge function. So I'm going to say TW Merge here, and I'm going to go ahead and wrap the entire class name. And then I'm going to say is mobile nav open and that will allow us to add some classes onto the class name if the mobile nav is open. And I need my ending bracket there so I don't have any complaints. Now, when it's open, we don't want to negatively translate y in the negative direction. So I'm going to say translate y0, and then we're also going to rotate this by 45 degrees. So I'm going to say rotate 45, and that should allow that to rotate whenever it's open. So let's go ahead and see if that works just by clicking this mobile nav and then seeing if our rotation happens. So I'm seeing the translate go in the right direction, but I'm not seeing it actually rotate by 45 degrees. And that's actually because I said 50 there. So I need to change that to 45, and that should allow it to rotate. So let's go ahead and click this and see if it rotates. And indeed, it looks like it does. I need to pull out my reference image so it's not showing on top of my current code, but let's go ahead and look at that. And yes, you can see that it's rotating by that 45 degrees. Now our other div, our other bottom hamburger nav line, we're going to have to rotate it in the opposite direction to form an X. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to wrap this one in TW Merge as well. Go ahead and wrap the entire class name in that. Make sure my bracket is there. And then we're going to say if is mobile nav open and that will allow us to add classes when one is open as well. And this one's going to say translate y0 to get that back to the center, and then negative rotate 45 should make sure that it's rotating in the opposite direction as our top line. So let's see what happens when we click this. I'm going to click this, and yes, indeed, it does form an X. But we don't want that to happen instantly. We want that to take a little bit of time. So I'm going to add a transition onto this class as well. So I'm going to say transition and then duration 300, and let's see if that's a good duration. I'm going to do the same thing to this bottom line, transition duration 300, and let's see if that looks good. If I click my mobile nav menu icon, I can see that yes, indeed, we go from our hamburger menu to our X, and that's exactly what we want to happen. Now, when our mobile nav is open, we want our mobile navigation to show. So we need to add another div below our header when the mobile nav is open. So in order to add something below our header, I'm going to need to add a React fragment. I can just have the starting React fragment be those two carets there, and then the ending React fragment can be at the bottom here. And then we can say if is mobile nav open and then we can show some JSX only when this is open. Now, the JSX that we're going to show is a div. We're going to go ahead and show some content inside that div. So we're still going to want our container. So I'm going to say div class name equals container here. And then inside of that container, we're going to have our nav, a semantic nav tag. And then inside that nav, we're going to have each of our nav items. So I'm going to map over my nav items again. So nav items.map. And then for each of those nav items, I'm going to, of course, output some JSX on the screen in the form of a link. So I'm going to say a href equals We know that there's going to be an href there. Not sure what that's going to be right offhand. We'll just fill that in with a dummy hash symbol right now. We also know that there is going to be a key, although I'm not sure what that's going to be right offhand. If I scroll up and look at my nav items, I can see that that includes a name and an href, so I can use those inside of this nav items map. So I'm going to deconstruct my name and my href here. And then, of course, for my href, I can fill this in so I can know my href is going to be my href key. For my key, I can just say name, and I can also say the same thing for the children of my link tag. So I'm going to say name right there, and that should show all of my nav items if this is open. So let me go ahead and click this and see if these actually show up. And it does look like they show up, which is a good sign. Now below my nav items, I'm also going to want to show my login and sign up buttons because we want to essentially show the entire navigation that you would see on the desktop in the mobile navigation. So I'm going to also map through my login items array as well and then show those items as buttons. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to say login items .map for those, and we're going to have a function that returns some JSX. The JSX that it's going to return in this case is going to be a button component, and that button component is going to have some children as well. So let's see what keys are in our login items that we can deconstruct. So we have a button variant key, we have a name key, and we have an href key. So going down into my array map, I can say button variant, name, and href, and then I can use all of those. So my variant is going to be on my button component. So I can say button variant as the value there. The name is going to be the children here. So I can say name there. And then we can wrap this buttons in a link if we'd like to by saying a href equals and then passing in the href from our mapped values. And then of course we also need a key. So I'm going to say key equals name, and that should ensure that that keeps React happy as it's mapping over those links. If I save that again, go ahead and open up my mobile nav menu again, we should see now that we not only have our nav items, our middle nav items here, but we also have our buttons. That's a great sign. Now let's go ahead and add some styles to start styling this mobile navigation up. What I can do to ensure that this always shows as I'm styling this is I can come up to my state and I can set the default value instead of false to true so that whenever I save and the page refreshes like it does, then it's always going to be open unless I hit the close button. So that will help me just to style this up. If I scroll back down, we know that a few things are going to be true. One of them is going to be that my navigation is going to be flex. So I'm going to say class name equals flex and flex call. That should ensure that my items show up top to bottom. I can also say items center. That should push those items towards the center of the page. I want to say gap 4 to give them 16 pixels of spacing between them. And then I can say PY8 to ensure that I at least have a little bit of padding on the top and bottom of the page. To ensure that these navigation items are in the center of essentially what will be our mobile nav, which will be everything except for the top bar here, I need to create that container first. So I'm going to say class name on my wrapping div, and this is going to be a fixed container that's going to be set to top 18. And that should ensure that it's basically right below our mobile navigation. And then we're going to say left 0, bottom 0, and right 0, and that'll ensure that it's taking up the rest of the screen. We do also need to say BG gray 950 because we do want this to be the background color of the rest of the page. As soon as we have some more content on here, we would have it showing through otherwise. So we'll say BG gray 950 to add that. And then we want to make sure that these other divs have a height that matches this fixed container. So I'm going to tell my container to be h full to make sure that it's the entire height of my fixed container. And I'm going to say the same thing for this nav right here. So let me go ahead and give this a BG of red 500 just so we can see the space that this is currently taking up. So it's not taking up that full container yet. Let me say H full, and let's see if that takes up the full nav container. And it looks like it does. In order to get our items towards the center, we can just say justify center, and that should push our flexed items towards the center of the page. Now that we see that it's in the right spot, I can go ahead and remove my BG red 500, and that should make sure that everything's in the right spot. My nav items should also look similar to how they look at the desktop size as well, where they're small and they're uppercase. So I'm going to go ahead and add a class name to my link as well to ensure that these look similar. So I'm going to say class name here, and that's going to be equal to text gray 400. We're also going to say uppercase and tracking widest to ensure we have the right letter spacing. I want to say font bold, text extra small to make sure that it's the right size. And as soon as we see our page update, we should see that take effect. Also for each of these, we'll go ahead and say H10 to match the height of our button, just so these all look equally spaced as we see our mobile navigation. And after we save that, we should see that that's looking pretty good. The other thing we want to do is ensure that our button is taking up the full width that we have available to us, or at least up to a certain point. So we want to add a new prop to our button. So I'm going to go back into my button component, and we know that we're using Class Variance Authority. This allows us to add variants that allow us to add styles. One of the variants we can add is block, and then we can say if this is true, then we can add some additional classes as well. So that is essentially what this is doing. This is a Boolean value that we're adding to our button. We're saying if it's true, then go ahead and say width full, and that will take up the full width of the parent container. And then for our default variants, we're going to say that block is going to be false by default, but of course someone can add it in if they would like to. Scrolling up, let's go ahead and ensure that our TypeScript type is also set up to take that variant correctly. So I'm going to say block Boolean, and that's going to be an optional prop that can be passed in. And the same is also true of the variant, by the way. If a variant is not passed, we should have a default variant of primary being set. So this variant is optional, so I can go ahead and set that TypeScript type to optional as well. After we've done that, let's go back to our header and see if we can go ahead and use that variant in order to set the width of our button. So I'm going to add in block here, and let's see if the width actually grows to be the full width. It doesn't look like it does, and I think that's because it's being constrained right now by our link here. So let's go ahead and add a class name to it as well and say width full, just to make sure that it's not constraining our button unnecessarily. Now that that's done, we can see that it's not constraining our button unnecessarily anymore, but they're still a little wider than I'd like them to be. So I'm going to say max width extra small, just to ensure that those buttons can't grow past a certain size. And I think that looks a lot better, even though it doesn't change the size that much, especially on the tablet size. That's going to be a lot better. There are a couple of cleanup items as well as something else I'd like to add to this particular nav. So one of the cleanup items is that we now see that the border from our mobile navigation is not showing up because our fixed navigation is showing up over top of our mobile nav. Now that's because we haven't added a Z index to any of this to tell it how to layer. So we're going to go ahead and add Z30 to our fixed mobile nav. And then for our header, we'll add Z40 to ensure that it sits above that. So for our header, we'll say relative, and then Z40 should ensure that it's going to sit above our mobile navigation. That does look like it works. Now I see my border bottom showing from my mobile header. So that is working well. Let's ensure that the close and open works properly, and that looks like it's also working well. The last thing that we're going to do is we're going to set up a couple of these orbits similar to how we see in our hero right here. We're going to have them behind our mobile navigation just to add a little bit of flavor and flair to this mobile nav. So in order to do that, let's see what we'd like to add them to. So this nav right here is essentially covering most of the entire fixed navigation. So we could add them there, or we could just basically add them to this outer div. I think I like adding them to this outer div. So I'm going to come in here and say div class name equals absolute. And then inside of that absolutely positioned div, we'll say div, and this will be what we'll call our orbit. Our first orbit is going to have a class name of size 200 pixels. That's going to be a custom value of 200 pixels. And we'll go ahead and give that a border as well. So border gray 200/30, and then rounded full should make sure that it's the right size. It's not going to show up in the right position though, unless we say that the absolutely positioned div here is going to push it towards the center. So this should say top 1/2, left 1/2, and then negative translate X 1/2 and negative translate Y 1/2 should push it towards the center of the page. It is over our button though, and that's a little bit of a problem because we don't want that to happen. So we need to isolate this on its own stacking index. We can do that with the isolate isolation isolate rule, and then we can say -z10, and that should ensure that we can pull it back a little bit from the rest of our content and have it actually sit underneath the content, which you can now see that it is sitting underneath of our content. Now that that's the case, let's go ahead and create a couple of more of these orbits. We're going to have a total of 4. So I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, and that should create our 4 orbits that we want. And each of these is going to be a little bit of a different size. So the next one up is going to be 350. The next one up is going to be 500. And the next one up above that is going to be 650 pixels. After we save that, we should see our orbits, but they are overflowing our mobile nav. So we need to add overflow hidden onto our mobile navigation to ensure that nothing can overflow outside of that container that is inside of it. Now that we've done that, our mobile navigation is looking good. However, what I don't like about this is we have a lot of just code here that we could clean up if we added another component. So I'd like to add another component to this, create an orbit component that we can use in the future, because we are going to be using this a few times throughout this build. So I'm going to come into my components directory and create a new file for orbit.tsx. And then that is going to export a const of orbit, which is going to be a React function that's going to take in some props, return some JSX, and for now we can just go ahead and have a placeholder div here. Let's go ahead back to our header and see what class names we need to add to these orbits. So each one has a size, it also has this border, and it's rounded full. So I'm going to just copy and paste these class names directly onto my orbit. So I'm going to say class name equals, and go ahead and just paste those right on there. Since this is a fairly simple component, I don't need to bring in anything like CVA because CVA would be overkill for this, but I will still bring in Tailwind merge. I'll import TW merge from Tailwind merge, and that should enable me to go ahead and allow a user of this component to dynamically set classes. The primary one is going to be this size class. And the reason I'm not bringing in a particular prop, but I'm going ahead and allowing this size to be set as a class name is because that enables responsive sizes to be done a lot more easily. So if we ever use something like responsive size, that would definitely matter. So I'm going to say props here. The props for this is just going to be HTML attributes of HTML div element. And I need to import that type of HTML attributes from React so that we can use that. We haven't used Tailwind merge yet, so I'm going to go ahead and add in my Tailwind merge function. I'm just going to wrap my class name in that Tailwind merge function. And then we're going to take our props.class name and add the class name in here after our other classes. So I'm going to say props.class name here, and that should ensure that our class name gets added. So anything here should be overridden by the classes that we add to our orbit. So by default, it's going to have a size of 200 pixels or a height and width of 200 pixels, but we can override that just by adding a class name on there, and that will be easy to use. So coming back into our header, let me go ahead and import this component that we just created. So I'm going to import orbit from @/components/orbit. And then coming down into my code where I used my orbits, let's see if we can replace these with a simple orbit component. So I'm going to replace this with orbit with a self-closing tag. I'm going to replace this with orbit as well, but of course I want to save the size. So I'm going to say orbit class name equals size 350 pixels, and go ahead and give that a self-closing JSX tag as well. And that means I can go ahead and remove my old one. This one below here is going to be orbit class name equals size 500 pixels. And then I'll remove my old code. And then this one down here is going to be orbit size 650. So I'm going to say orbit class name equals size 650 pixels. And that will ensure that I have a 650 pixel orbit, and I wanted to have a self-closing tag there as well. The only other thing that I see in here is I'm using a lot of these centered absolute divs. What if we could create a class? So instead of writing absolute top 1/2, left 1/2, negative translate x 1/2, negative y, translate y 1/2 every single time, what if we could create a custom utility class in Tailwind to be able to encapsulate that functionality? Well, of course we can do that. I wouldn't suggest it unless we could. So let's go ahead and just copy that code, come into our globals.css, and we're going to create in the base a custom utility. And this is going to be called absolute center. And that custom utility is going to apply these classes right here. So it's going to apply absolute top 1/2, left 1/2, negative translate x 1/2, negative translate y1/2. This is a common centering technique for absolute positioned divs. So this is going to just allow us to add absolute center, and it's going to apply all these rules. So after I save this, I'm going to come back into my header and I'm going to start using that custom utility. So instead of all of these, everywhere that we use that, I'm going to replace that with absolute center. And as soon as I do that, we shouldn't see any changes if we've done this correctly, but that should clean up our code a lot, just make it a lot more readable and manageable. Now that we've done all that, I think our mobile navigation is complete. So let's take one more look. Let's go ahead and close this out, open it back up. That transition all looks good. We have all of our mobile nav items. They don't go anywhere yet. Of course, we can come back and link those up later, but at least we have a working mobile navigation. I want to pull out my browser window and ensure that this also works well on the tablet size. So let me go ahead and open that up. And I need to pull my reference image out side by side so that I can see this a little bit better. Let me go ahead and close that up and just verify that this still looks good on the tablet size. I think on the tablet size, we actually need one more orbit just to make this look a little bit better and not so small on this size. So let me go ahead and pull out my header and just add that one more orbit in here. So I'm going to just add one more. It looks like they're about 150 pixels in difference. So this one's going to be at 800 pixels in size. Save that, pull back out my browser window and just see what that looks like when it gets to be that 800 pixels. And that does look better to me. So I like where that's headed. And then over on the desktop view, of course, we should not see this mobile navigation at all. So we need to make sure that our mobile navigation is set to a default value of false as to whether it's open or not. So now that we're done working with it, we can take this is mobile nav open and say the default value is false. And that should ensure that it's closed by default. Now, when I pull back out my browser and go through all these views one more time, it works on mobile. It works on the tablet. And of course, as I close it and come over into my desktop view, I shouldn't see my mobile nav showing up here. So everything is looking great. I think our navigation is done. Our header section is done, which means it's time to move on to our impressive hero section. Let's look at the design first. Now that we're done with the nav bar, let's go ahead and move down to the hero section. You can see that we're going to have a title, a description, a button, and we're going to have an image with an overlaid animated input here just to add a little bit of visual flair. As we come down a little bit lower, you're going to see we have some companies here, but we're going to get to those in the next section because we're going to contain all of our content to this one particular section. You can actually see that our orbits end right before these companies right here. So even though it looks like one section, we're going to code it up as two different sections. Coming over into the tablet view, it's a little bit bigger now. And we see that we also have a couple of planets here that are now showing up on the left and right. So we'll see how we're going to handle those. And then on the desktop view, you can see we can see even more planets, but now we're also bringing in some additional boxes here on the left and right that kind of make it seem like the robot is having a conversation, which is what we want for this AI page. Now, these are going to have a parallax effect on them when we come back and we do the animations for this section. You've got a great hero image here that really takes center stage for this section. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the code. In order to get started coding our hero section, let's go into the source directory and open up our sections directory and come into our hero.tsx file. You can see that this is currently returning a section tag with the text of hero section. So it's not currently showing up in our page, which means it's not currently hooked up yet. Let's go into the app directory and go into page.tsx where we can hook up our hero section. So I'm going to import my hero component from @/sections/hero, and that should allow us to drop this right below the header section here. So I'm going to just go ahead and drop in that hero section, hit save, and if we've done everything correctly, as long as we're refreshing, we should see the words hero section show up on our page, which we do. Everything should be hooked up correctly. So I'm going to close down my page.tsx, come back into my hero, and we can start to fill this in with the appropriate content. Now, the first thing I'm going to put in here is a div with a class name of container, and that should hold our content from the edges of the screen. And then I'm going to start creating the content with semantic tags. The first one is an H1 that says unlock the future of AI conversations with Sphereal. Sphereal should be that. And then below that is a description. We'll make that a paragraph tag, and it's going to say harness the power of AI with Spherial, elevate your productivity, and streamline your workflow with our cutting edge AI chat platform. Okay, that should be that paragraph there. And then below that, we are going to have a button. Now we already have a button component. So for now, I'll just go ahead and create a button placeholder, and then we'll replace this with the button component as soon as we come back into our style. So I'm going to give this the content of start chatting, which would be the content there. And then below that, we should have an image, but we can't currently see that very well because we can't scroll down over here. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a little bit of padding bottom with a class name at the top of this section. And I'm just going to say PB 1000 pixels, and that should allow us to just be able to scroll and see the rest of our reference image over here on the right. So we see that we have this robot image here. So I'm going to go ahead and import that from the top. So I'm going to import my robot image from @/assets/images/robot.jpg. That should allow me to use my robot image, and I'm going to want to use next image because of course we are using Next.js. So I'm going to import image from next/image, and this should allow me to actually use next image here. So below my button, I'm going to add in that image component. I'm going to give this a source of robot image or robot img. We're going to give this an alt tag of robot image, and then I'm going to go ahead and give that a self-closing tag and see if we see that image showing up on the page, and it looks like we do. So that's good. That should be the entirety of the content for this particular section. So now it's time to worry about our styles. We can see that we have a section border around this section. So you can see that here on the left and the right, we have a border that constrains our content all the way down. So we do want to account for that border inside of our code. So inside of our container, which is pushing our page away from the left and right hand sides of the page, we want to wrap this in another div. This is going to be for that border. So I'm just going to go ahead and wrap this in a div and give this a class name of border L and border R for border right. And then go ahead and give that border color, which is our border gray 200/30, if I'm not mistaken. Since we have a border color that's consistent across all of our borders all the way down, it would be great if we didn't have to remember what this color was. So I'm going to actually copy this into my globals.css as a variable. That way we know what this is. So I'm going to say color border, and that's going to be theme colors.gray.200, and then it's going to be /30%, and that should make it the right color. And then let's see if we can actually use that inside of our hero. So I'll say border, and then go ahead and give it a custom color of var -- border color, and see if that shows up with the right color. Of course, in order to get this to work, we're going to have to call this the right variable name. So if I go back to my variables, I used color border, but for some reason I said border color over here. So that's never going to work. Let's go with color border, and that should show up correctly after that. I also want to very quickly verify that I'm using the same color as I did in my header section. So if I go down into my header section and look at what I was using, it looks like it's slightly different because here I'm using /20. In my border color variable, I'm using /30% instead. So I'm going to change that to the 20% that I should be using, and that should match that up across the board. I'm not going to go back and change my header at this point. I've already created all of that code, so we'll just go ahead and move forward with this for now. After we've created our border around the left and right sides, of course, we still don't want our content touching that border either. So we're going to create another div inside of that border. Let me go ahead and shut down my sidebar for now, just so we can give a little bit more room for the code. And let me wrap my content in another div. And this is going to be a div that we can go ahead and give a class name of, actually container again would be a good class for this, because that would ensure that we have the same padding on the left and right of our page for our content as we have for our border. So that container has a max width, but it doesn't have a min width. So as long as the outside container is holding it, all it's going to do is add the same amount of padding inside of our page. So I like that class name for that particular reason. We also do want to go ahead and add some padding top and bottom. So that's going to be with our PY rule, and that is going to be 24 for 96 pixels of padding top and bottom to match our design. Now that we have our containers aligned, let's go ahead and move into our H1 and see what class names we need to give this to style it up. So I'm going to give this a class name, and I'm going to say text 4XL to make it the 36 pixel font size. We also want to give this a weight of font semi-bold, and we'll say text gray 100 to give it a lighter color than the rest of the body. We know this needs to be in the center, so I'm going to say text center here, and that does look like it aligns pretty well with what we have in our design. It does look like there's a little bit of a difference in our line height though, so I'm going to go ahead and try and account for that with letting tight, and that should give that a little bit more spacing in our line height for this particular title. Moving down to our description, let's go ahead and give this a class name as well. We know that this is going to be centered on the page, so we'll say text center. The font size is going to be text large to give it that 18 pixel font size. And we need to give this margin as well. So I'm going to say MT8, and that should give it some top margin to push it down from the title. Now that we've styled those two things up, we're moving down to our button. So let me go ahead and import my button component. I'm going to say import button from @/components/button. And let's see if we have that available to us. I'm going to go ahead and replace my JSX button tag with our button component. And let's see if it creates a button as soon as I hit save. It doesn't look like we have a component like that. Let me go ahead and try and import it using the named export instead of the default export, and that does look like we have that available to us. So now we have our button. Let's go ahead and give that a variant of secondary, because that's definitely not a primary button, but it doesn't look like we have that variant defined in our button. So we're going to need to go into our button. I'm just going to command click that on my Mac, and that should allow us to come into our button and look at what we have defined for the class names for this. For our secondary button, we're going to go ahead and give this a background of a near white. So I'm going to say BG gray 100, which is going to be the same color as our hero text for this particular section. And then we're going to say text gray 950, and that should give that the right font color as well. So now that I've done that and accounted for my secondary variant, I'm going to go ahead and close out my button.tsx and come back into my code, and then go ahead and give this a class name to adjust the spacing for this. In this case, we just need to make sure that we have some margins. So I'm going to say MT10 to give that 40 pixels of top margin. And we also need to make sure this is centered on the page. And we can do that just by wrapping it in a flex container and justifying it to the center. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap that in a div, give that a class name of flex justify center, and that should ensure that it's aligned towards the center of the page where we need it to be. As we continue to scroll down, we can see that we have our image and it's wrapped in a border. So we're going to have to go ahead and wrap this in a div. I'm going to give that a class name for now, just as a placeholder there, and make sure that it's wrapped in that div. That div is going to have some top margins. So let me give that MT20 for that top margin, just to push that down a bit. And it looks like that may have been a little too far. So I'm going to bring that back a little bit with MT16 and see if that aligns it a little bit better. And it does look like MT16 is the value that we're looking for there. We need to make sure that we have a rounded border here. So let me go ahead and give this a value of a rounded 2XL. That should give that the right border radius that we need for our image. And we also know that we need to have this border gradient. So let me give this a border 2, and that should allow us to have the border around our image. And then we're going to make sure that we don't overflow our image. We'll just say overflow hidden here, and that should make sure that our image is constrained to the border that we've given it. Of course, we want the border for this image to be the same border that we've used for our button. We could rewrite all of those class names, but that might not make as much sense as going ahead and coming into our button and seeing what those class names were, and then copying those into a utility class that we can then reuse. So we can see that for our primary button, we have our border to border transparent, and then we have this background linear gradient that is constrained to both the padding box as well as the border box. Those are exactly the classes that if we use them for this image, that should allow us to have that border gradient that we need. So I'm going to copy those, come into my sidebar, open up my globals.css, and go ahead and add a utility class, which I'm going to call border gradient. So if we add in that class and then paste in those styles and come back to the very beginning of those and say at apply, that should apply these styles anytime we add this class of border gradient. We can quickly test this out just by coming into our button.tsx and replacing this variant primary with our new border gradient utility class. And if we've done everything correctly, if we change this button in our hero to a primary button, we should see that it looks the same as it did when we were using the class names that were directly applied. And it does look like our border gradient utility class is working the way that we intended. So let me go ahead and switch this back to a secondary variant. Let me go ahead and close down my sidebar again to give our code a little bit more room. And then we'll just go ahead and use that utility class here with border gradient. And as soon as we hit save, we should see that we now have that gradient border being applied to our image border, which looks really nice. Now, for some reason, when we've done that, I'm seeing that my image now got moved up a little bit. So let me go ahead and switch this back to MT20 and see if that aligns it more with the design. There may have been just some kind of quirk there with the design versus the hero that we're working on currently. Overall, so far, it looks like our content is aligned, but to verify that, I'm going to go ahead and bring my reference image on top of my actual code to see if there are any differences with our reference versus what we have coded up right now. And the only real difference that I'm seeing is there may be some differences in the words that I put down here at the end. So let's see if we see any differences there. Let me pull back my reference image to side by side, and it looks like we said your, but the design says our. So let me go ahead and replace that word or take out that Y, and that should take care of that problem. I go ahead and overlay my design again and see if things look good after I scroll up and down. And it looks like we now have everything aligned to the design, which is looking really good. So I'm going to pull back out my reference image to side by side. We still have a little bit of work to do on this section because, of course, we need to add a background. We need to add this underline here. We need to add these orbits that we see. And of course, we need to add the text that says AI is generating. So all of those we need to still add to our styles. Let's start with the underline under the word spherical. So let me go ahead and create a span tag around my spherical text with an ending span tag there as well. And then since I want to add an SVG element here, I'm going to go ahead and create another span tag just around the text itself so that we can hold a sibling element inside of our parent span tag here. We need to import our underline image in order to use it. So let me go ahead and import that up top. So I'm going to say import underline image from @/assets/images/underline.svg. And we're going to use the same URL trick that we used for the logo, because in this case, we also want to use this as a masking image rather than directly using the SVG as a component. So I'm going to say $URL, and that should give us the source of that underlying image. Coming back down to our span, that means we can then use that source inside of our span tag. So I'm going to create another span below my original one. Let's go ahead and give this outer one a class name of relative. And then we can come to our second span, which is going to hold our underline, and we can give this a class name of absolute. We're going to make sure that it is the width of the text itself. So I'm going to say width full. We'll say left 0 and top full is going to push it down 100% from the top. And then we can bring that back a little bit by saying negative translate y 1/2. That'll just bring that up a little bit. And we'll also want to give this a background of a gradient. Now, this is the same gradient that we're using for our conic gradient around both our logo and our primary button variant, but this is going to be inline instead of being a conic gradient. So this is going to be a custom defined gradient. So I'm going to say BG linear gradient, and we're going to say that it's going to the right, and it's going through our colors. So var color amber 300. It's going to go to var color teal 300. It's going to continue going through var color violet 400, and then it's going to end at var color fuchsia 400. And let's see if that is what we need here. So let me end that with that bracket. And let me hit save and see if we see that gradient showing up. And we don't currently, and part of that reason is because we have not defined a height on this absolutely positioned div. So it currently has a height of 0. Let's go ahead and define that height with h4 to make it 16 pixels tall. And then as soon as we hit save, we can see that we're now showing that linear gradient. Now, in order to mask this, we're going to go ahead and come into the starting span tag and go ahead and add some attributes to bring in that SVG as a mask. So I'm going to say style equals, and we'll say mask image. And that's going to be a URL of our underline image dot source. And that hopefully should mask that. And we see that that does work, but our mask is a little bit too big. So let's go ahead and add some additional styles here to bring that down. So we're going to say mask size is going to be contain. We'll also say mask position is going to be center, and mask repeat is going to be no repeat. You should be familiar with these types of rules because this is very similar to how you would set a background image and control how a background image is showing up on the page as well. So that looks like it's right. In order to test that, let's bring our reference image over and overlay it on top of our coded page, and we can see that it does look right. So I'm gonna go ahead and bring that back out now that we've verified that. With that in place, the other piece of content that still isn't on the page is this little floating input here. So we need to make sure that this is absolutely positioned on top of our robot. So if we scroll down the code, we know that this is where we're defining our robot image. We'd like to add that floating input above that. So let's go ahead and create a div for that floating input field. We don't have a relative rule on here, so I want to make sure that the parent has a relative class to position that relative, which then means that we can position this other one as absolute. Inside of that absolute position div, we want to go ahead and create our input. So that's just going to be a div. We're going to put a loader inside of that. So for now, I'm just going to put a placeholder div for that. And we also want to have some text. So that's going to be this div right here. And then we're going to say AI is generating. And that's just going to be some static text. And then we also want a span here for our cursor, which is just going to be that vertical bar character. After I hit save, we're not seeing that show up quite yet, or at least I can't see it on the page yet, but I do need to import my loader SVG. So let me come up to the top of the page and go ahead and import that. I'm going to import loader from @/assets/images/loader. And we're not going to use the animated version yet. We'll do that when we actually animate this on the page. But I'm going to replace this div that we have here with my loader icon. And that should ensure that my loader can show up on the page. In order to start positioning this absolute div so that it shows up on the page, let's go ahead and start to do that. So we know that it's positioned absolute, but we need it to show up near the bottom. So I'm going to say bottom 2 to make it show up 8 pixels from the bottom. And then the left is going to be towards the center. So I'm going to say left 1/2 and then negative translate x 1/2. And that should pull it towards the center of the page. The actual div itself is going to have some styles as well to have that black background. So I'm going to say BG gray 950/80%, and that should give that dark background. We also want to flex that to have our content show up next to our loader icon. We're going to want to give that items center to ensure that our items are aligned to the center. And then we're going to say gap 4 to give that 16 pixels of spacing in between our content and our loader icon. We also want to give this some padding left and right. So that's going to be PX4. And for top and bottom, we can say PY2, and that should give the top and bottom padding. We want some border radius as well. So I'm going to say rounded 2XL, and that should be that border radius that we need. And then to ensure that it's the right width, we'll say width full to make sure that it is 100% of the width. And that seems like we might not be able to use width full to get that to push out. So I'm going to try actually using a width of a custom value of 320 pixels. And let's see if that actually pushes it out. And then we can say max width full, which should give it that max width of 100%. Now, in order to ensure that the right max width is added, we need to make sure that this absolute position div has a width of full, and then we say px4 here to give this padding that's going to push that absolute position div in a little bit from the sides of our image. After we've done that, we'd like to style up our text a little bit. So let me give this div a class name here, and that's going to be font semi-bold to give it that bolder text. And then we'll say text XL to make sure that it is the 20 pixel size that we see in the design. We also want it to be a little bit lighter. So I'm going to say text gray 100, and that will make sure that it's also a little bit lighter. And then our loader also needs to have a color. Let's try and style that with a class name of text violet 400 and see if that gives it the right color. And that looks like it does. We're now seeing that that is looking very close to the design, if not perfect. So let's go ahead and come up to our reference image and go ahead and overlay our design on top of our code and see if there's anywhere where that is looking different. And that looks exactly the same, which is definitely exciting because that means that that is all taken care of. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull that reference image out back to side by side and then just take care of the background that we see here. Now this background is going to be right in the center of this div, which means that we can put it inside of this second container here. I'm going to go ahead and make that a relatively positioned container that will allow us to hold our background. Now we can put that background inside of a div that's positioned absolutely. So I'm going to give this a div with a class name of absolute. And we'll go ahead and make sure that's exactly as big as this container by saying inset 0. And then we'll say BG and give this a custom radial gradient that's going to be a circle measured to the farthest corner. And then we're going to start it at var color fuchsia 900. Now we might not have this variable yet. So let me go ahead and save this and then check that we have that actual custom property up in my globals.css. It doesn't look like we do yet. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in. I'm going to add in a color fuchsia 900, and that is going to be equal to theme colors.fuchsia.900, and that will allow us to use that custom property. The other custom property that we're going to be using here is an indigo. So go ahead and add this at the bottom of my colors list. So I'm going to say color indigo 900, and that is going to be equal to theme colors.indigo.900. And that'll ensure that we can use that custom property as well. So coming back into my hero, let's go ahead and see if we save that again. If we do see that color start to show up, and we shouldn't because we actually only have one color so far. So let me go ahead and add another color and then we'll see if we can see that color. So this is the color fuchsia. We also have the var color indigo 900. And after we save that, we can see that those two show up. And then the third one is just going to be transparent to show the background color through this radial gradient. Now coming in here, we don't want this color fuchsia 900 actually starting at 0%. We actually want it starting at 50%. So I'm going to say underline and then go ahead and give that the 50%. And then we want this indigo showing up at 75%. So let me go ahead and add those two percentages there, and that should help with that. We're also going to ensure that this radial gradient is toned down a little bit. And the way that we're going to do that is we're actually going to mask that from black to transparent. So what that's actually going to do is start to fade it into transparent. So if I add on my absolute position div a mask image, we can say radial gradient here as well. And that's going to be the same size of circle farthest side. And we'll say from black to transparent. And that should ensure that we start to fade that out as it goes from the center out towards the edges of this section. Now that we've done that, we also want to pull this down a little bit so we can isolate this as a stacking context by adding the isolate class onto our parent. And then here in our absolute position div, we can say -z10, and that will just ensure that that absolute position div comes under our content. Now that's looking good, but of course we still need our orbits in this section. And of course we're going to need to fade those out as well. So I'm going to add another div inside of here that's going to hold our orbits. That is going to be the full size of the section as well. So I'm going to say class name equals absolute. Inset 0 to make it the right size, and -z10 should go ahead and pull this down below our other content as well. Now we do already have, as far as I know, an orbit component. So let me just double check that we do have that component. So that means we can use this inside of this div right here. So I'm going to import that into my page by importing orbit from @/components/orbit. And then I can start to use that component right here. So I'm going to go ahead and give this a div just for an absolute positioning div here, kind of like we did with our other orbits. I'm going to say class name equals absolute center. And then I'm going to put the orbit inside of that. So orbit is going to be right here. And then I'm going to give this a class name of size 350 pixels. That's going to be a custom value of 350 pixels. And let's see if that shows up correctly. I'm just going to go ahead and give that a self-closing tag and see if we see our orbit showing up there. And it looks like we do, which means that we can add a couple more of these as well. So I'm going to actually give this a total of 5 different orbits. And then we're just going to go ahead and change the size of these different orbits. So the first one's going to be 350. The next one is going to be 600 pixels. The third one is going to be 850. The fourth one will be our 1100 pixels. And then the fifth one is going to be 1350. And after I save that, we should see that our orbits are showing up in the right location, but there are a couple things we need to do to ensure that they don't go off the edges of this section. Number one is going to be coming into this container and making sure that it is overflow hidden. So I'm going to say overflow hidden here to ensure that none of our content flows outside of it. And then we also want to make sure that we have some sort of fade out on the top and the bottom. Otherwise, we're going to get this looking a little strange on top and bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and come up to the same container and just go ahead and mask this with a linear gradient. So I'm going to say mask image linear gradient to bottom, and then we'll just say transparent black at 10%, black at 90%, and then transparent again. And essentially what that will do is it will fade in everything from top to bottom, transparent to the black of 10%. So at 10%, it's going to start showing everything at full opacity. And then as we come down to the bottom, it's going to fade everything out in the last 10% down to no opacity. So that's all that mask image does, just gives that nice transition for our content to flow to the next section of the page. Now that that's done, it looks like everything is looking good in this section. So let me once again overlay my reference image on top of my code and see if there are any differences that are glaring and standing out. I'm not seeing any right offhand, which means I think our mobile view for our hero is done. Let's move on to our other responsive views and see what else we see that might need some work. As I look at my tablet view and I look at the differences between our coded version and the design, we can see that the text is definitely a little bit bigger. We definitely have a little bit of padding on top and bottom. So I'm seeing those differences, and I'm seeing my planets introduced for the first time. So we'll want to make sure that we create those and make sure that those are in this section as well. In order to start making some of those changes, let's go and first address our padding. So it's currently PY24. In the medium size, we're going to want to make this PY36, and that should give us the padding top and bottom that should match the design. The other thing we're going to want to do is bring up our heading font size. So this is text 4XL. We're going to want to bring this up in the medium size to text 5XL. That should ensure that it becomes the right font size. And I think we also have a little bit of a change in font size in our description as well. So this is currently text large. We're going to want to bring this up in the medium size to text extra large to make that the right font size as well. That looks like it's correct, but of course we won't be able to tell until we overlay our reference image on top of our coded page. So let me go ahead and hit overlaid here and see if there's anything else that I see that's a little bit off. And the one thing I am seeing that is slightly off is also our floating input here on our robot. That is a little bit different. So let me go ahead and pull my code back out and see if we can align that at the medium size as well. We see that it is currently bottom 2 at the medium size. Let's go ahead and make that bottom 2.5 and let's see if that brings it up. It doesn't bring it up quite enough. So at the medium size, let's go ahead and bring it up to bottom 4 and let's see if that aligns it with our design as well. It looks like it does align it on top of our design, so I'm happy with that. So the last thing we need to address in this particular section are these planets that we see in our design. So let me go ahead and pull back out our design so that we can see this side by side to really get a look at these planets and start to understand how we're going to align these. I think the best way to use these is going to be to tie them to the top of this image so that they always stay within range of this image, even as the padding and the font size of other things might change. So the center of our section actually changes a little bit as we go from our mobile section all the way to our desktop. You can see that the center of that section will change. So we want to have a consistent place to tie these planets. And I think that's going to be to the top of this image, which means we're going to put it inside of this relatively positioned div right here. And we'll just go ahead and put that right inside here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a div for our planets. That div is going to be absolute position. So I'm going to give this a class name of absolute. We're going to want to position that right in the center. So that's going to be left 1/2 and top 0. That should position it right here at the top of our image. And then we just need to go ahead and insert those planets, and then we can translate them into the position that we need them to go. In order to start creating my first planet, let me go ahead and give this a div with a class name here. And they are going to be a violet color. So we're going to create a gradient. So we'll say BG gradient to bottom, and that will be from violet 400 to our background color of gray 950. And that should create them in the right color, and then we'll make them the right size. So in this case, we have size 8, and that should make them 32 by 32 pixels. So as I come back over to my coded page, I can see that we do now have that planet showing up, but it's not rounded. We want to make sure that that border radius is added on there as well. So let's say rounded full to ensure we have that more planetary look. After we do that, let's go ahead and start moving this planet into position. So we'll make this the planet that is on the left-hand side over here. And I think an easy way to do that would be to just go ahead and overlay my reference image, and then we can see if it's in exactly the right spot. So let me take my planet and go ahead and give this a translation. So I'm going to say negative translate X, and let me give this a custom value of 300 pixels and see if we're actually getting close here. We are getting close, but we're not quite there. So let me go ahead and give this a 320. It's a little bit too big. Let's go ahead and give this 310, and maybe that's 312. And that looks like it is pretty well aligned, but we'll go ahead and see once we translate the Y position as well. So I'm going to say negative translate Y, and we'll go ahead and give this 80 pixels and see how close we are there as well. As soon as we do that, what happens is our overflow hidden role is kicking in and actually hiding our planet from view now that we've pulled this up in the negative direction. So what we need to do is probably wrap this in another div just to be able to get the overflow hidden role out of the way. So I'm going to wrap all of this in another div. We're going to give this a class name of relative, and we'll wrap this around our content. We can just drop that ending div in wherever there in our line of ending divs, and then we can leave this one here. But what we'll do is we'll move this planet out of our image itself, and then just go ahead and pull it inside of this relative div that's wrapping our image. And now we can see that our planet is indeed showing up here, although it's not quite in the right position. So let's go ahead and see what we can do to get it to translate to the right position. Let me move this to 315 and see if it gets closer. That definitely looks closer. And then let me pull this down to 77 and see if that is any closer as well. Looks like it's a little bit off still. 76 looks like it might be the right position. So that looks right. Now we just need to get it turned in the right direction. So it's currently coming from violet 400 to gray 950 from top to bottom. We want to make it look like it is reflecting the light that is coming from the center of this image. So what we'd like to do is actually just rotate that. So if we rotate it, we can rotate this 45 degrees, 90 degrees, but we have a custom value here that I've added to the Tailwind config of 135 that should allow it to be rotated down towards the light like we see right here. And that looks like it's in the right position. And we'll move this back by one more pixel just to see if it gives it that extra level of crispness that I'm looking for with that planet. It looks like it does. So we'll leave that at the negative 316 and the Y value of negative 76. And I think that one is in position. Now, since we don't want to continue to write all of these classes every single time, the best thing to do would be to create a component for our planet as well. So I'm going to come into my sidebar, create a new file inside of components called planet.tsx, and that will allow us to create our planet component. I'm going to export a const of planet, and that will of course be a React function that takes in some props and returns some JSX in the form of a div. Let me come back to my hero and copy the classes that I've used for my planet. So this is going to be all of these right here. And let me go ahead and word wrap this as well so that we can see all of the classes that we've used. So this is all of these BG gradient ones. I'm going to remove some of these, but I want a lot of them to be here because of course I don't want any of my positioning classes to be included in the ones that are included in my component. That's going to be on a case by case basis. And of course the rotation is going to be the same way. We'll just leave it rotated towards the top and allow the user of the component to add those classes on. But we do want it to be rounded full. We probably want it to be size 8, at least for this particular planet. For this particular planet, we also want it to be from Violet 400 to grade 950. And we want the BG gradient to be to the bottom. So all of that is accurate. Let me go ahead and word wrap this one as well so we can see those different classes. Now for this component, there are going to be some different size and color options that we're going to want to add as we continue to create these, because we know that we're going to have a teal planet, we're going to have a fuchsia planet, they're going to be some different sizes. So I think the best thing to do would be to once again use our Class Variance Authority in order to create the options for this planet component. So I'm going to import CVA from Class Variance Authority so that we can use this to create the classes for our component. I'm going to say const classes is going to be equal to our CVA function. We're going to have some default class names. We're going to have some variants that we can add. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in there. And of course, we're going to have some default variants as well. So we're going to want to add those in. So for our variants, we're going to want to add a size prop so we can change the size. And we're also going to want to be able to change the color. And for the size, we're going to have options of small, medium, and large. And then for the color, we're going to have options of violet, teal, and fuchsia. All those are going to be options. And then for our default variants, we probably want them to be equal to whatever this planet is right here. This is going to be the largest one. So our default variants for size is going to be large. As you can see, it auto-filled that. And then for color, we're going to leave that at violet. So those are going to be the default variants, but we're going to change these based on the props that the user of this component passes in. So if it is a violet color, we're going to use this from Violet 400 rule. And of course, let me go ahead and pull all of these classes up into our default, and then we'll just grab them from there. So the first one, we're going to want to say from Violet 400 if it is a violet one. So we'll just go ahead and paste that class inside of there. Also, if it is a size large, we're going to say it's a size 8. So I'm going to pull this out and put this inside of my large size planet. And now that we have the large violet classes created, we can just go ahead and use this classes function just by simply passing in our classes function. And to make it a little bit more obvious what's going on here, I am going to go ahead and pass it some different props. So I'm going to say, okay, the size that it's taking in is going to be equal to our props.size. The color is going to be equal to props.color. And we're also going to pass in a class name that's going to be equal to props.className. After we do that, we need to bring in our props. And of course, we're going to want to type these with Typescript to make sure that we're enabling the correct props to be passed in. So we know that we're going to have a size prop. That size prop is going to either be able to take small, medium, or large. And then we're also going to have a color prop. That color prop is going to be optional, but it's going to take violet or teal or fuchsia. And then the planet is also going to be able to take any prop that can be passed through the HTML attributes, the default HTML attributes of an HTML div element. And I need to bring in that HTML attributes at the top from React. So I'm going to import that HTML attributes type from React. After I've done that, it looks like everything in TypeScript is happy, which should mean that we have now enabled a large violet planet. So let's go back to our hero and see if we can now use that and drop this in place of our div right here. So I'm going to come above that. I'm going to make sure at the top of my div I have this component imported. So I'm going to import planet from @/components/planet. And that should allow me to then use that planet. And let me come back down to where I was using that planet and see if I can drop in that component here. So I'm going to say planet. The size is going to be large. The color is going to be the violet color. And of course, we're also going to pass in a class name that's going to control the translation of and rotation of this planet. So let me go ahead and just cut and paste my class name for that. And then we can hopefully just go ahead and comment this out and still see our planet show up in the right spot. And just to verify that, I'm going to pull my reference image back out to ensure that my planet is still showing up. And it does seem to be, which means that I think we created our component correctly. I'm going to go ahead and remove this other div and just go ahead and leave this planet right here. Now to get our other planet in place, I'm going to bring back our reference image for a second, scroll up and down just to get it aligned, and then go ahead and add another planet. We'll add it to the same position for now, but we know that we're going to change the rotation and the translation. So I'm going to remove those classes and then start just bringing this second planet up. So I'm going to say negative translate Y, and we'll just start with a value of 200 pixels, a custom value of 200 pixels, and let's see where that starts to place it. So it's placing it right here in the center. We also know that we need to translate it in the X direction. So I'm going to translate X, and let's just say 550 pixels for now and see how close we get to where our other planet's at. Looks like we overshot it by a bit. Let's bring that down to 500 and see if that gets any closer. Doesn't look like we're quite there yet, so let's continue to bring this down to 400 and maybe even 300. Okay, and then we start to see our planet in the right spot. We also want to rotate this, so we're going to give this a negative rotation, in this case of 135, because we want it to be the opposite of what we had for our other planet. So it looks like it's facing the center again, or the light is reflecting from the center here. And then we just need to make sure that our translation values are correct. So it looks like we were bringing this down a little bit. Let's try 180 and see if we get a little bit closer, and we'll bring this back up to 190. That looks very, very close. Let's try 189. And that looks like it's almost there. Let's do 188 instead. That looks like it should be exact. And then we need the translation in the X direction to be a little bit more. So let's try 320. We're almost there. Let's try 334 maybe. And that looks like it's lined up exactly on top of our other planet. So these values should give us that alignment. With that second planet in place, I don't think there's anything else that we need to take care of on the tablet size. Let me just go ahead and swipe back and forth and see if it looks exactly like it does in the design. And it does look like that's the case, which means we can move on to our desktop view. And for just to be able to see everything, I'm going to pull this back out to side by side as well. So before we move on to our desktop view. In our desktop view, let's go ahead and pull out this browser all the way to see what the differences are with our desktop coded page and the page we see over here in our design. So there's a couple of things. Of course, we have a couple of additional planets, but it looks like there's also some max width containers that we need to start adding to our title and our description. It looks like the padding is changing a little bit on the top and bottom, so we'll need to handle that. And the font size for our title is definitely changing as well. So we'll need to handle all of those things in our code. So I'm going to bring my code back out so we can kind of get a better idea of what we have here and start making some of those updates. The first thing I'll tackle is the padding top and bottom. So this is going to be this container right here. So at the large size, this is going to switch over to PY48, and that should ensure that our padding is a little bit bigger. We also want our title size to change. So let's come down to our H1 and say at the large size, this is now going to be text 6XL to make it big enough that it matches what we have over here on the right in our design. And I don't think the font size of our paragraph changes, but I do think that we have to add some sort of container to make sure that it's the right size as well. And it looks like we want to constrain that to a max width of 3XL. And as soon as we do that, if we look at our coded template, it's going to pull our text to the left. We're going to say MX Auto to pull that back into the center like our design. After I've done all that, let's scroll down to see if there's anything else in this section. And of course, at this section size, we now see that we have these boxes here that have text on the left and right of our robot. So we're going to want to handle those as well. So let's come down to our image and see how we can add those in. Right now, we have our planets being added inside of this relative container. That's probably where we're going to want to add these floating boxes as well. In order to start adding those in, I'm going to just go ahead and add a div here. This is going to be an absolute position div. So I'm going to give this a class name of absolute just so we can start to see this. And we'll go ahead and position this for now at top 0, left 0, just so we can see the content as we create it. For my box, let me go ahead and create a div here. And then we are going to have a couple of divs inside that for the content. The first one is, can you generate an incredible front-end dev video tutorial? And then for my second div content, that is going to be a div that's going to contain 1M ago for 1 minute ago. And let's scroll back over and see if we can see that content showing up on the page. I'm not seeing it showing up yet. So let's verify that it has the proper Z index as well. I'm going to say Z10 to see if we can pull this up. And of course, I want to go ahead and give this an isolate class to isolate our stacking index. And that should hopefully bring that up as well. Okay, so now that we have that in place, we do now see that that box is showing up. So let's go ahead and style up that box with the right styles to ensure that it shows up correctly, styled how it is in the design. So I'm going to give this a class name, and we're going to say that the background is BG gray 800/70 for 70% opacity. We'll say that the backdrop is blurred as well. So backdrop blur medium. We'll give this a border of gray 700. We'll say that the roundedness is, or the border radius, I should say, is rounded XL. We're going to give this some padding of 16 pixels, so we'll use P4 for that. The width is going to be equal to 288 pixels, or the 72 class within TailwindCSS. And I think for the backdrop box, that should be about it. Let's go ahead and make sure our text is styled inside as well. So for our 1 minute ago, let's give that a class name and say that the text is going to be aligned to the right. With the text right class, it's also going to be gray 400 to make that the right color. It's going to be small, and we're going to switch the font weight to font semi-bold. With all that in place, it looks like we do have this box styled up, and now we need to move it into position, and we're going to move it with this absolute div right here. So with that absolute div, we'll go ahead and say that it's going to be about 30% from the top. So we'll say top 30%, and we need to remove then our top 0 to get it in the right spot. And then we're also going to pull it out to the left. We'll say negative translate x10, and that should pull it 40 pixels to the left, which we are seeing. However, it looks like that might not be the exact position because our image is going a little bit wider than what I'm seeing in the design. So there might be something where we're going to have to add some sort of max width to our image to make sure it doesn't go too wide versus what we see in our design. So in order to do that, we can go ahead and take our main relative div that's kind of wrapping everything and say max width 5XL MX auto. And then hopefully that should pull in our image a little bit and allow our content to show up in the right spot. And so far it looks like it is showing up in the right spot. So after I do that, let me go ahead and pull out my browser again, just to get a better look at where this is at versus my design. It looks like it's correct. So that's definitely a good sign. So let me pull this back in again, and we know that we need to create another one of these floating chat bubbles. So we want to go ahead and do that as well. Now we could make this a component, and of course I'll leave that up to you as to whether you want to make this a component or not. But since I'm only using this 2 times, I think it's going to be okay for me just go ahead and kind of copy and paste what I have here. So I'm going to take what I have right here and go ahead and paste it, and then we'll just change the text and the positioning in order to get our second chat bubble showing. So going over and looking at the text, it looks like this is this div right here where we're going to want to put in a strong tag to make our brainwave response show up with the font, the correct font weight. So I'm going to say brainwave : and then we'll say I created one based on videos from Frontend Tribe. And that's going to say, instead of 1 minute ago, it's going to say just now for that particular box. Now, if I scroll back over to my content, it should show up on top of my other one, and it looks like it does, which means we need to change the positioning of this. As you can probably guess, instead of left 0, we're going to use right 0 here. And then instead of translating it in the negative direction, we're going to translate this in the positive direction, as well as changing how far this is from the top. So it's going to be 50% from the top. And as I do that, I can see that it looks like it's showing up in the right position. Of course, the best way to verify that is going to be to overlay our design on top of our coded template. So let's go ahead and do that now. And as I scroll up and down, the only thing I'm really seeing that's different is not these boxes, which are definitely showing up great, but it's this bottom floating input that looks like it's once again changed position on us. So we need to make sure that we're accounting for that in our code. In order to do that, of course, we're going to need to go down to that floating input and ensure that the bottom is set up correctly. So we see that in the mobile size, it has a bottom value of 8 pixels. At the medium size, a value of 16 pixels. Well, at the large size, it's going to have a bottom value of 40 pixels with bottom 10. As soon as I set that, I do see that it aligns properly with my design. So the last piece we need to do is go ahead and add in these additional planets that we're now seeing show up at this view size. So let me go up to where my planets are and go ahead and add a couple more planets here to add these in. So the first one is going to be this fuchsia one. So that's going to be this fuchsia, and it's going to be a size of small. And of course, it's going to be at a different position as well. So as soon as I save that, let me go ahead and take off these rules, because we know that we're going to be translating this to a different position. We don't have a fuchsia color or a small size yet, so we'll need to go ahead and come to our planet.tsx and add those in. The small size is going to be our size 4. That's going to be 16 by 16 pixels. And the fuchsia color is going to go from fuchsia 400. And that should allow the fuchsia color to show up properly. So let's come back to our hero.tsx and let's see if we can start moving this around and seeing this show up. So I'm going to say negative translate y 100 pixels, or with a custom value of 100. And let's see if we just see this show up. And I am seeing this show up now that I pull this out from behind my image. Now we just need to get it into the right spot. In order to do that, we'll start with a negative translate y value of 300 pixels. We'll also give this a negative translate x value of 500 pixels, and let's see how close we get to getting this to the right spot. It looks like we're still pretty far off, at least in the y direction. So let's go ahead and give this negative 350 and see how close that gets us. Looks like we're not quite there. So we'll do negative 360 and then 370, and that looks really, really close. Maybe negative 371 will pull it exactly into position. We know we're going to need to rotate this as well. So we're going to go ahead and give this the class of rotate 135 to get this facing the light direction that we see here in the design. Let me actually make this negative 372 because it looks like it's a little bit off. And then for our negative x direction, we're going to go ahead and give this negative 510 and see how close we got. So that was really close. Let me bring this back down to maybe 508 and see if that gets it right on the money. And that does look like it's exactly in position, because I'm not seeing any blurriness around that planet anymore. So that's a really good sign. For our other planet, that's going to be this teal planet over here. So we're going to have to come and account for that as well in our planet.tsx. In order to have a teal color, we can say from teal 400, and that should go ahead and allow us to add that gradient value on when we select that color of teal. And then the medium size is going to be a size 6. So that will allow us both of those options. Now we can come back to our hero, go ahead and copy and paste our last planet, and we can go ahead and give this planet additional different options. So the color is going to be teal, the size is going to be medium, and it should show up right now at the same spot that our fuchsia planet shows up, which of course it does. Now we just need to move this one in position as well. So let's start with a negative translate y value. It looks like it's pretty close. We just need to get this going in the positive x direction instead of the negative x direction. So that looks good. We know we're going to need to rotate this negative 135 because it's going to face this center here. And then for our x direction, we need to give this a little bit greater value than 508. Let's try 518. That's actually a little bit less than that. So let's do 500 and see if this gets it a little bit closer. So it is closer. We're going to need to bring this into the 4s. Let's try 490 and see if this gets any closer. It is better. Let's try 488 and maybe even 486 and see if that puts it in exactly the right position. That looks correct. So let's go ahead and leave it at that value until we at least get our Y direction taken care of. So this is a little bit high right now. So we're going to bring this down to maybe a 360 or even 350 pixel value. And let's go ahead and pull this back down into 340 and maybe 342 will get it to be correct. And that does look right. Let's just get our X value a little bit higher and that looks like it will be right. Okay, so this is the exact value that we need for this particular planet. So let's go ahead and save that and we have our planet in place. With that, I don't think there's any other changes in this section that are different than the design. So I think our desktop size looks good. Let's go ahead and pull out my browser. I'm a little worried we may have messed up some of our other sizes. So I'm going to pull out my reference image over to side by side and go ahead and look at these other sizes as well. So as I come over to my tablet view, I can see that I'm now seeing these chat bubbles show up. I shouldn't be seeing these at the medium size. So let me go ahead and account for that inside of my code as well. If I come down to those chat bubbles, you can see that those are right here and right here. So in order to make sure those only show up at this size, let me go ahead and add a hidden rule onto this first one. And then I'm going to say large block, and that should make it show up only at the large size. And the same thing is going to be true for the second one. So I'm going to say hidden large block, and that should make that show up only at the large size as well. So let me pull out my browser window again to see if we're accidentally showing anything that we shouldn't be showing. The tablet view is looking good, and coming back down to the mobile view, everything is looking good there as well. So I think we are done now with our hero section. So far, it is looking really, really good. I'm seeing everything looks like it is properly aligned. So the last thing I'm going to do to clean up this section is just come back up to my section and take off my padding that I had added just so I could see the entirety of my design alongside of my code. And that shouldn't change anything, but it should just allow our next section to be added on properly. And with that, let's go ahead and move on to the next section of our design. As we look at the companies coming down below our hero, we can see that it almost looks like it's part of this section, but we are going to, like I said before, code this up as a separate section. However, this will not have any top padding, but it will have the padding bottom that's equal to a lot of our other sections. So we'll have to make sure and account for that. We'll also want to make sure that it has the same left and right border that you're seeing here. We do have these crosses at the bottom of this section, but we're going to account for that at the top of our next section. So we're not going to worry about those crosses yet. We're going to get to those in a bit. Coming over to our tablet view, we can see that there's not too much has changed. We're of course seeing the same kind of section, but we're going to be showing an additional logo that's coming into the side here, where this is going to be flowing from left to right, of course, as soon as we get this all coded up and animated. And then in our desktop view, we can see that we have something that looks very similar, but of course we're continuing to show more logos as the screen gets bigger. So not too much is changing for us. We are going to be changing some padding values and things like that. So we'll make sure and account for all that as we dive into the section. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the code. In order to get started with this section, let's go ahead and link it to our page. So let's come into our sections and look at our companies.tsx. You can see that we have this constant array that has been created with a name and logo for each of the companies. And then we have this simple section tag with the word companies. In order to link it to our page, let's open up our app directory and go to our page.tsx and import that section onto our page. So I'm going to import companies from @/sections/companies, and that should enable us to use that component. So let me go ahead and drop that companies component onto our page right at the bottom, and then scroll down and see if we see the word companies on our page. It does look like we do, which means that it is properly linked up in our page. We can close down our page, open back up our companies section, and go ahead and start to create the code for this component. In order to see this, like I've done with the hero section, I'm going to go ahead and add a class name of PB 1000 pixels, and that just ensures that I can see the content alongside the design over here on the left. So I'm going ahead and added that in there, but then we're going to go ahead and add the code for this particular section. I'm going to close out my sidebar and go ahead and work on this code. So the first thing I'm going to add is this div class name equals container. And then inside that container, I'm going to add an H2, a semantic H2 for the title of this section. That's going to say empowering creators at leading companies. That's going to be that. And then for each of those companies, we of course are going to map through those and show the logo for those companies. So we need to go ahead and say companies.map. And for each of those companies, we are going to be having a function that returns, of course, some JSX. And for each of those, we're going to have a div that wraps the logo itself. We're going to want to deconstruct that logo from our array. So we'll say logo here. And of course, we'll say name and deconstruct both of those. And then the key is going to be equal to the name. And then for our image, we'll just use the SVG logo directly. So that is going to be our logo. And let me just go ahead and capitalize this so that we can use this as a React component. So let me say logo here, and let's see if that shows up correctly. And of course it doesn't because we don't have that as a key. We just need to rename that using this colon. That should rename this up to our uppercase logo. So that looks like that's working out. And then we just need to add a div around all of these. That's going to be our wrapping div that's going to allow us to style these up correctly. Now, there are a couple of patterns in our hero section that we want to replicate for this particular section as well. But unless we want to continue to add the same classes over and over again, we're going to want to make some of these things components. So let's come back to our hero and see what we can use as components. One of the things I'm looking at is my border left and right. I would like to componentize that wrapping div so that we can just drop it in and have the border show up. The other thing is going to be the actual content wrapper where we're sticking another container in here. So both of those I'd like to make components. Let's come back into our hero and see if we can extract those into components. So the first one's going to be this div with border L, border R, and our color border. So let's go ahead and create a component for that. Let me go ahead and into my components directory. And this is going to be section border is what we'll call this. So we can create a file with the name sectionborder.tsx, and then we'll export const section border. That's going to be equal to a function that's going to take in some props and return a simple div. And that's going to be what that does. Let's go ahead and make sure we have our props being passed in. And we'll type these here in 1 second. We know that this section border component is going to have a class name. This is going to be a pretty simple class name. We are going to want to allow someone to override the classes in it though. So we're going to import our Tailwind merge function. I think this is going to be overkill if we used something like our CVA function that we've been using, because this is going to be a simple component. So I'm just going to make this class name use Tailwind merge, bring in props.className. And of course, we're going to also have some default classes here as well. So back in our hero, let's go ahead and copy and paste the classes that we have that we're using for our border into our section border component. So I'm just going to paste those right in, and let's go ahead and add a TypeScript type to these props so that TypeScript is happy with what we've done. So I'm going to say HTML attributes of an HTML div element, and we need to import that type, that HTML attributes type from React. So I'm going to import HTML attributes from React, and that should ensure that we can use that HTML attributes type there. After we've done that, that means that this is just basically going to house our border classes. And so I can come back into my hero and then use this component, go ahead and wrap my hero section in this component. So I'm going to import section border from @/components/section border. And then I can use that by replacing my div with that section border component. So I'm going to just go ahead and create this section border here. And then I'm going to go ahead and look at where the ending div was. It's all the way down here at the bottom. Let's go ahead and make that the ending section border as well. That white line does guide me down to the right position. After I've done that, I can see that it actually takes away all of my children. That was an unintentional side effect of the fact that we actually didn't spread the props, so we didn't include children here. We can do this in a couple of ways. The easiest way is just going to be to add ... props here. That's going to spread our children and make sure that the children still show up within the section border. So the section border does look like it's working well. Let's go ahead and come back into our companies and drop in section border as well and see if this creates the correct border around this section as well. So I'm going to say section border here. As long as I start using this and hit enter, it should import this for me. And then I can just wrap this around my current content and see if it, after I hit paste here, see if it goes ahead and adds that section border in the right spot. It does look like it is adding that section border correctly, which I think means that we've created this component correctly. The other thing I'd like to extract from my hero is this interior content wrapper that's going to push our content away from the section border. And we'll call that, for lack of a better term, a section content component. So I'm going to create a new file for that as well. Inside of my components directory, we'll call that section content.tsx. And inside of that component, I'm going to export const section content. This will be equal to a function that, of course, returns a div. And I'm just going to go ahead and give that a self-closing tag. If we come inside of our hero.tsx, let's go ahead and remove these classes as well. This is going to be our section content. And essentially what that's going to do is it's going to add in this container class for us. It's also going to add in the padding top and bottom to ensure that we have consistent padding on the top and bottom, because each of our sections are going to include very similar padding on the top and bottom. So we can just componentize that. And then if we need anything else like the overflow hidden or mask image, we can allow a class name to be passed in for those particular things. So I'm just going to copy my container and my padding top and bottom into my section content component and go ahead and add a class name here. We're also going to use the TW merge function here, and we're going to have a default class of the classes that you see here. We need to import that TW merge function in order to be able to use it from Tailwind merge. And after I save that, that does allow me to use that. And then for my props, it's going to look very similar to what we've just done with our section border. We're going to say HTML attributes of an HTML div element. And we also need to import HTML attributes. So I'm going to import HTML attributes from React. After I've done that, I need to use my props. This is unused right now, so I'm just going to add in the ability to add a class name by dropping in props.className here. And I'm going to do a very similar thing here where I just go ahead and spread the rest of my props onto my component to ensure that things like children get added to this div as well. As I look at these classes again, I think the only other class I'd like to also bring over is the overflow hidden, because we're never going to want things to come outside of this section content. So I'm going to add overflow hidden here as well on top of these other classes that we already have listed here. So let's use that section content inside of our hero. Let's replace our class here as well. So I'm going to import this component just by starting to use it. So I'm going to say section content and then hit enter. That should import it. And then I need to drop it into the right spot as well by dropping it inside of my section border here, the ending section border here at the bottom. After I've done that, I want to change these classes. So this is going to replace this div right here. So I'm going to start removing some of these classes and see what I need to keep and what I need to remove. So I need to go ahead and take my relative, my isolate, and my mask image up to my class name and make sure they're dropped into my section content. And then everything else is going to be removed. So I'm going to say class name here, and then go ahead and drop in those additional classes. I already have overflow hidden, so I can remove that one. So it's just going to be section content, and it's going to say relative, isolate, and then my linear gradient mask image. And then since I removed that div, I need to come down to the bottom here and then remove the ending div, because we'll have one too many ending divs if we don't go ahead and make that adjustment. So after I save that, my hero should show up exactly as it did before, but for some reason it isn't. Let me double check that I have everything set up correctly inside of my section content. Okay, so it looks like my mistake here was actually to spread props out for this particular div. And the reason is because it's overriding the class name that I'm trying to set with these default classes. It's actually taking the next class name that I pass in and only using those styles instead of also including these ones. So what I need to do is actually go ahead and destructure my props before I pass them into my component. So I'm going to say const class name, and then I'll go ahead and have a rest prop of other props, and I'm going to make that equal to props. So essentially we're going to be pulling out class name, and then all the other props will be included in this other props variable. So then I can use, instead of just dropping in props directly, I can say other props here, and then instead of props.class name, I can just directly use the class name variable. And after I save that, I should then see my page update where it should use both these classes here and the class names that get passed in. That was a little bit of a weird bug there, but definitely one that is not unsolvable after you know what's going on. I probably did the same thing with my section borders. Let me go ahead and make sure that that's not a problem here as well. So let me go ahead and destructure this as well. So I'm going to say const class name ... other props, and we're going to make that equal to our props variable that gets passed in. And then we're going to make this a spread of other props and then go ahead and pass in class name here as well. And after we save that, we shouldn't see any changes because I don't think that we passed any class name here. So it actually didn't override my border, but it definitely could have had I passed in other classes to it. So that's a little bit of a sneaky bug that we were able to avoid. After doing that, let me go ahead and close out my section border because I don't think I'm going to need that anymore, as well as my section content and my hero because I don't think I'm going to need that. And I'm going to come back to my companies.tsx and drop in my section content that I now have. So section content, and I'm going to wrap that inside of my section border, and that should push my content over properly. Now, the difference between the rest of my sections in this particular section, because it looks like it's part of my hero, it actually doesn't have any padding top on it. So I'm going to have to add that modifier and say class name equals, and I'm going to say PT0, and that should ensure that I don't have that additional padding top that should not exist for this particular section. Now that we have those components properly in place, let's go ahead and add some classes to our title to ensure that this is styled up correctly. So here we're going to say text center to push this to the center of the page, text extra small to make it the right size, font bold for the correct font weight, uppercase to make sure that it is transformed uppercase, and then tracking widest should ensure that it has the right letter spacing, and we'll say text gray 500 to make it the right color. For our logos, we'll need to wrap these. Actually, we'll need to wrap these in 2 divs. And the reason is because we're going to want to flex one and then have one hiding our overflow. So for our first div, we're going to want to say class name equals, and we'll want to make this the one that flexes our logos left and right. So we're going to say flex. We'll say gap 18 to make sure that they're spread properly. And then they're going to kind of go off of the page here. But then in order to kind of hide that overflow and make sure that we don't have any problems, we're going to wrap this in another div. That div is going to be flexed as well. So class name equals flex. And then we can come into our child div and say flex none. And that will basically ensure that these can take up as much space as they want without being constrained by a wrapping flex div. Now for this flex div, we are going to want to add some margin to the top. So I'm going to say MT20, and that should account for the top margin that we see in the design. It does look like the start of these logos also has some padding as well. So let me go ahead and add that in. That's going to be PX18 to ensure that we have the right padding on the left and right of that particular section. And then something that's not readily obvious, but will be obvious when we hide the overflow left and right, or overflow X clip, is that we actually don't have this flex container going all the way up to the edge of our section. And that is because, of course, we're pushing that in a little bit further with our container. So we need to account for that with some negative margin at this parent flexed div. So I'm going to say MX, negative MX4, and that should account for the margin that we had added to that. So that was 16 pixels. So we basically said that the negative margin was also 16 pixels to then push that all the way up against the section. So when we animate this over, it's going to appear that it's coming in at that section border and then it's leaving at the other section border. With that, it looks like our mobile styles are correct, but of course we can verify that by overlaying our reference image on top and scrolling up and down and seeing if we have any differences from our design. It does look like we have a slight difference, and I think that's due to the fact that in the design, our logos are constrained to a height of 32 pixels. So let's go ahead and add that in for each one of these. We can say class name, or actually we can directly add this to the logo where we can say class name equals H8, and that should constrain our height to that 32 pixels and make it align with the design perfectly, which it looks like now that it does. So with that, let's me go ahead and back out my reference image because it looks like that is pixel perfect. And I'm going to go ahead and go over to my tablet view and see if we have the same thing over here. At my tablet view, I do have the padding showing back up at the top of this section. Let me close out my sidebar to give my code a little bit more room to breathe. And that's because we know that the section content is adjusting the padding at every single responsive size. So what we could do here is say the medium size still has PT0, or this might be a good time for us to use an important rule in Tailwind CSS and just basically put an exclamation point at the front of our class name. That means that it's going to add an important rule to that particular style. I don't normally advocate for important rules, but there are cases in which they make sense. And I think this might be one of those cases where we just say, this is always going to have PT0. We don't need to worry about it. We can just add that important rule and have it always be taken care of. At this screen size, it looks like the gap between our logos also changes a bit. So let's go ahead and take care of that by adding a medium modifier and saying gap 36. That should ensure that our logos are spaced out a little bit more at this size. And that looks like it is pixel perfect, but we can check that by overlaying our reference image once again and scrolling and seeing if we see any differences. I'm not seeing any differences at this point, so let's go ahead and pull back out our reference image and go check our desktop design and see if everything is looking good over there. I'm going to pull out my browser window to the max width. I'm going to overlay my reference image because I don't see anything right offhand. And I can see that there is a little bit of difference at this size. Let me see what may have changed at this particular view. So let me pull back in my code and think about this a little bit. One of the things that we're doing inside of our section content is we're adding this container. Now, what you can see is that the container at the tablet size is actually a different padding than at the laptop or desktop size where it actually doubles. So at the laptop or so at the tablet size, that container padding is going to be 16 pixels, but at the full desktop or laptop size, that doubles to 32 pixels. Well, we're accounting for negative margin here, but only negative margin of 16 pixels. We need to say at the large size, let's bring that to negative MX8. That should account for the negative margin at this full 1200 pixel size. And as soon as we add that, we can see that now our logos are aligning perfectly, which means that this section is done and we can move on to our next section. Coming back into our design, we are moving down into this features section. So you can see that it has a title. We have a checklist with a couple of icons. We have a button that we should already have a component for. And we have this interesting circular spherical logo with these SaaS logos around it. So we're going to want to create that. That'll be definitely interesting to create. Let's see what this looks like at the tablet size. So at the tablet size, this does get a little bit bigger, but it is still aligned top and bottom. And then over at the desktop size, as we scroll down, you can see that we're now aligning this left and right. So this will definitely provide a couple of challenges because we are going to start to account for these crosses at the top of our section. We're going to, of course, want to create this logo graphic that we see here, but I'm sure we'll be able to do it if we dive into the code. So let's go ahead over to the code and dive in. Coming into our code, let's go into our sections and look at our features section and see what's in here already. So we have all of the images that we're going to be using for these logos. We have the features themselves and the logos array that should allow us to be able to output those. And then down at the bottom, we have this features component that just returns a section tag with the text of features. So in order to hook this up to our page like we've done with our other sections, let's go into our page.tsx and import that component. So I'm going to import features from @/sections/features. And then I'm going to drop this into the bottom of my page by just going ahead and dropping in that features component. Now, if we've done this correctly, we should see the text of features. One of the things I'm thinking about as I hit save and refresh over here on to the right is that we had all of this padding bottom that we added to our company section in order to allow us to see the design that we never removed. So I need to go back to my company's component real quick and take off this padding bottom rule that we added here. And that should allow us to see the features section in the right spot, which we now do. So let me close out my companies.tsx as well as my page.tsx and come back to my features section. We're going to use a similar trick to be able to see the design. So I'm going to say class name PB 1000 pixels, and that's just going to, of course, add a little bit of padding bottom to allow us to scroll and see what's over here on the right. Now let's go ahead and add the content for this section. We know that we're going to have a container, so I'm going to go ahead and add a div with a class name of container. And then inside that div, we know that we're going to have our border. So we're just going to go ahead and drop in section border right here just because we know that we're going to be using it, as well as our section content component that we created earlier. Now, the great thing about these components is that they allow us to have those styles already set before we ever start to create the content for this section. So that's really great. For our content, we're going to have an H2, and that's going to say your AI powered collaboration companion. And after we hit save, we should see that show up. And then for my list, I'm going to have a UL. Now for these items, we already have these in an array. So that array is called features. We can just loop over that array and then show each of these features. So I'm going to say features.map, and each one of these is going to be a feature, which we can deconstruct. And then of course, we're going to show some JSX that's going to have a list item. That features array is just a string, so we actually aren't deconstructing anything here. So I can say feature here, and then for each of these, we can say the key is equal to that feature string, and it has a text of feature as well. When I hit save, I should see that list showing up correctly, so that is looking good. Below that, we have a button. Well, we already have a button component, so I can just bring that in directly by starting to use that button component and hitting enter. And the text for that is going to be try it now. And then below that, we do have this graphic that includes our logo as well as all of these different logos around it. This is going to be somewhat complicated to build, but of course I know that we can do it, but we need to go ahead and create a div. We're going to go ahead and start dropping things inside of this div. For now, until we get more complex and we've styled up our other content, I think all I'm going to do is drop in a couple of orbit components here. So I'm just going to go ahead and drop in our orbit component from @/component/orbit. And let's go ahead and save that. That should have a default size on it. And we can come back to this. That'll just be the placeholder for now for where we're going to create that graphic that we have at the bottom of that component. So with all that in place, let's go ahead and start to style some of the content for this section. We're going to start with our H2 and give this a class name of text3XL. That should make it the right font size. And then font semi-bold should make it the right font weight. Since it's a title, we'll also say text gray 200, and that should make it a little bit brighter than the regular body text that we have here. For our list, we do need to move this down a little bit. So I'm going to give the UL a class name here, and we'll just give this MT12 to give this 48 pixels of margin top. We also want to flex these list items. So we're going to say flex call to flex them in the column direction, and then say gap 8 to spread them by that 32 pixels of space. Inside, these LIs are also going to be flexed because, of course, we're going to have an icon next to our text. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap my feature text in a span tag, and that'll allow me to style it separately from the icon itself and, of course, from the wrapper LI. So for this, we're going to have a class name of flex, and we're just going to say items center to ensure that our items are in the center, and gap 4 should split our icon as soon as we have it from our text itself. Now the text is going to have a class name of text XL to make it the right size, and then font medium is going to make it the right font weight. Just give it that little bit of boldness that it needs to stand out. For our icon, I'm actually going to use a component provided by the Font Awesome parent company, Fort Awesome. So I can import that. That's going to be called Font Awesome Icon. And that's going to come from a package called @FortAwesome/React Font Awesome. So as soon as I go ahead and save that, I should be able to use that icon as a React component. So I'm going to put that right before my span tag here as that component. And then I'm going to go ahead and say icon equals, and then we're going to also drop in an icon there. Now, I can also grab that icon from a package as well that's also provided by Fort Awesome. So I'm going to import that as well. So I'm going to import FA circle check from @FortAwesome/free solid SVG icons, and that should allow me to use that as my icon. So let me go ahead and drop that into the icon prop, and let's see if our icon shows up. It does show up. It's way too big and it's not quite the right color. So let's go ahead and add some styles on that with a class name and say size 6 to bring down the size. And then we'll say text violet 400 to adjust the color to the right color. Now, after I scroll up and down, I should see that it now looks like it's aligned to my design. So coming down to my button, we also want to add classes to this to push it down from my list. So let me say class name equals MT16, and that should hopefully push that down as well. And as soon as I scroll, that does look like it's aligned as well. Now, before we move down to our graphic that's within this section, let's go ahead and take care of a couple more things. Number one, we need to take care of the crosses that are at the top of the section border. So it looks like we need to adjust our section border component to be able to tell it when we want to show this top border for our section border. So let me go into that component just by command clicking it, or we can navigate to it in our directory structure. And we need to be able to take in a prop that tells it that we want to add on a border top. So I'm going to add an additional prop here. I'm going to say border top, which is going to be optional, and Boolean means that we can actually make it true or false. And then I'm just going to include all of my other props that I already had with that ampersand symbol there as well. Now, if there's a border top, we want to adjust our class names to account for that. So we'll go ahead and say border top and then we'll just go ahead and add border T, and that should allow the border top to show if that attribute is being used. I didn't destructure that from the prop, so I'm going to have to do that as well. So border top should destructure that and allow us to use that. So we currently aren't using this prop, but of course we could be. Let's come back into our features component and then go ahead and add that prop here. Just say border top, and that should show that line across the top, which it does. Now, when we have the border top, we also want our crosses to show for the section as well. So inside of our section border, we're going to want to add some JSX if that is the case. In order to do that, we don't want to drop children directly onto our div anymore. We want to enable children to be passed in a little bit differently. So we're going to have this opening div tag. We're going to have a closing div tag. I'm going to destructure children, and I can still pass in other props here just by saying other props, but we are going to want to pull out children. And we're going to drop children in as a child of our div in this case. That will allow us to have other divs that we can then manipulate independently, which is of course going to be these plus icons that we're going to be using for this section border. In order to do that, we can say that if border top equals true, then we can show some additional JSX, and that's going to be a couple of divs wrapped in a React fragment. So the first one is going to be a div. Inside of this div, we're going to have a cross, and of course, we're going to have another div with a cross as well. We're going to add the same React component we did before. So let's come to the top of our file and say import font awesome icon from @fortawesome/React font awesome. And we want to also bring in the icon we're going to be using, and we're going to say import FA plus from @fortawesome/free solid SVG icons. And then we can drop that into this div here. So I can just say font awesome icon. The icon is going to be equal to FA plus. And then of course we can style that up. Let's go ahead and duplicate this into our second div as well, just by dropping that in right there. We know that these pluses are going to be way too big, so let's go ahead and give this a class name of size 4, and we'll make them a gray color with text gray 200. Now we're going to have to copy and paste these styles onto our second one as well. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, push my sidebar to the side just so we can see our code a little bit better. And now we have our icons, but of course they're not showing up in the right position yet. So we need to make this border relative. So let's go ahead and say relative just so we can position both of these absolutely. So the first one's going to be class name equals absolute. This one is going to be top 0 left 0, which is actually exactly where it is right now. However, we want to pull this over on top of our border. And the way we're going to do that is just basically saying negative translate x 1/2 and negative translate y 1/2. And that should pull it right to that edge where we need it to be. So we kind of need to do the opposite for the other one. So I'm going to say class name equals absolute top 0, but then this is going to be right 0 to push it over to the right. And then we'll say negative translate y 1/2 to pull it up halfway, and then we can say translate x 1/2 to push it half of its own size to the right, and that should take care of that top border. Now that looks really good, and we can reuse this anytime we want to add another border top in the future. We can just add the border top prop, and it'll add all this code for us. That's the beauty of using these components, is that we have all of this saved and we can reuse this very, very easily. So I'm going to close out my section border because we're done with that component and come back to my features section. Now that all that's in place, let's go ahead and work on our figure that we have at the bottom of this section. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure it's the right size by giving this a class name of a size with a custom value of 270 pixels. That will ensure that it's the right size. And then we can just go ahead and set this orbit to a class name of size full. Now that'll make sure it's 270 pixels, but we also want this to be positioned absolutely because everything in this is really going to be positioned absolutely. So to make that happen, let's go ahead and wrap this orbit in a div with a class name of absolute inset 0. And we also want to ensure that this is relatively positioned so that it's containing anything that is absolute inside of it. For our second orbit, we will do this a little bit differently because we're not directly setting this to the size of 270 pixels. So this will be a custom value of size 180 pixels. And in order to get that to the center, we can just use the utility absolute center class that we created earlier, and that should push it towards the center. For our logo, we're going to want to do something similar. So we'll say div class name equals absolute center. But for this logo, we want to pull this in. And of course, in our header, we already created our logo. So let's go back to our header.tsx and see how we did that. Now we could copy and paste this code right here, which is our logo code that includes this conic gradient and the sizing and all the masking and all that. But I think what would be better is if we created a component in order to house this functionality that we could drop into the header as well as our features section and anywhere else we needed to use our logo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and copy this and bring it over to my components, create a new file called logo.tsx. And inside of my logo.tsx, we're going to export a const of logo. That's going to be a React function. And we're going to return essentially the code that we had inside of our header. We don't have our logo image yet, so let me go ahead and import that. I'm going to import logo image from @assets/images/spherical logo.svg. And I'm going to use that same directive. The question mark URL is going to ensure that we get the logo image URL instead of a React component. After I've done that, let me save this and let me go ahead and make sure that there is the ability to bring in props. For my props, I'm going to type that as HTML attributes of HTML div element. And I need to import HTML attributes from React. That's a type that's specific to React. So let me say HTML attributes here as well. That should allow me to import that prop. And then for my props, I essentially want to destructure a couple of things. I want to destructure my class name and my style, and then allow the rest prop to go ahead and be added here as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say const class name style ... other props and make that equal to prop. So essentially I'm destructuring a couple of variables out of it, as well as going ahead and give myself this rest props that I can drop in here as well. So I'm going to use Tailwind merge to be able to allow the user of this component to add any classes that they want to add to it as well, more specifically to change things like the size. So I'm going to import TW merge from Tailwind merge, and then directly use that by saying TW merge here, and going ahead and adding on class name, the class name variable that I destructured for my props. Now, in order to see all this, let's go ahead and toggle on word wrap. And we also want to allow someone to change the style if they so desire. I don't think they'll want to, but let's go ahead and add in the ability by just saying ... style. So essentially what that does is allows a user of this component to add a style prop, and it will update any of these if they are overridden, or it will add on new styles. And then we can also add on other props, and that will allow the user of the component to drop on other props as they so desire. After I've done that, let me go ahead and use this new component inside of my header and make sure everything still looks the same. So I'm going to just remove that and go ahead and start using my logo component that I just created. It's going to be self-closing, and it's going to be the same size as the old one. We don't need this logo image here because that's now imported into my logo component. And after I save that, let's see if my logo still looks the same at the top. It does look like it does, which I think means we implemented this component correctly. Now let's try and use it inside of our features section. Inside of this absolutely positioned div, let's go ahead and bring in our logo component and just go ahead and give it a self-closing tag. We're going to need to adjust the size. So I'm going to give this a class name. I'm going to say size 24, and hopefully that should make it the right size for our usage, which it looks like it does. Now, the next part where we put these logos around this orbit is going to have some complexity. So let's go ahead and talk through how we're going to do that. The first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to make a couple of divs. So the first one's going to be this outer div, and that's going to be essentially the div that is going to be the same size as this outer orbit. Inside of that, we're going to have the div that's going to be the border around our logo. So I'm going to create another div for that. And inside of that is going to be the image itself. So that I'm going to use next image to go ahead and create that. And I'm going to go ahead for now and just take the first logo. That's going to be the Slack logo. And I'm going to give it an alt of Slack logo just to make TypeScript happy and go ahead and save that. Now that shows up here, as you can see. So let's go ahead and rearrange how this shows. And I'm also going to add an outline to this so we can see the different divs as we're manipulating them. So let me go ahead and do that outline right now, and then we'll start to manipulate our divs. So class name equals outline, outline 1, outline red 500. That's going to be our outer outline. And then our inner one is going to be this one, class name equals outline, outline 1, outline red 500. That's going to be our inner div. Now, both of these are right now the same size. So let me go ahead and make the outer one absolutely positioned. And we'll also say inset 0. That'll make it the same size as our outer div. And then for my inner one, I want this to wrap around my image. So I'm going to give this a flex class, and that should allow it to wrap around my image, inline flex should allow that to happen properly. Let's make this inner one the right size by saying size 10 to make it 40 by 40. And then for our image, we're also going to add a class name to this one. So class name equals size 6 to make it the right size. To position it, let me go ahead and switch this over to word wrap and put in my sidebar to give my code a little more room to breathe. But to position this one, we're going to say items center justify center, and that should push my image to the center of this div. We're also going to want to put a border around this one. So I'm going to say border and border var color border should make it the right color. We're going to just use that custom property that we created earlier. And then to go ahead and give it a little bit of border radius, we'll also do that with rounded large. That should give it a little bit of border radius. Now that we have in general our styles, now we need to get this logo to the right position. And how we are going to do that is essentially take this inner outlined div and say that it is also going to be an absolutely positioned div that is going to be left 0, but top 1/2. And then we can pull it in position with translation. So negative translate x 1/2, negative translate y 1/2 will ensure that we can pull it into the exact position that it needs to be on this orbit. Now that looks good, but let's see if we can replicate this for the second Docker logo as well. So I'm going to copy and paste this, and let's see what changes we would need to make to get the Docker logo to show up correctly as well. So I'm going to say Docker logo here. And I'm going to change my alt tag, although it's not going to matter because I am going to replace this eventually with a map that's going to map over our array of logos after we know what we're doing. Now, in order to get this to work, what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to rotate my Docker logo 45 degrees because as you can see, this whole div, in order to get this in the right position, it needs to rotate. So I'm going to say rotate 45. And when I say rotate 45, you can see that that does rotate it, but my Docker logo also rotates with it, and that's not great. So we basically need some negative rotation to keep it facing the right direction. So the inner div is going to take some negative rotation of the same amount. So negative rotate 45 will put that Docker logo in the right spot. So essentially what we need to do is for each one of these, we're going to need to rotate the outer div and then negatively rotate the inner div by the same amount around our entire circle. So the first one is going to be, of course, rotated 0, and then the inner div is going to be negative rotate 0. Now, it's not going to be done with classes though, because we can't use dynamic classes with Tailwind Merge. So in order to actually get this to work, what we're going to do is we're going to add a custom style on here, and we're going to say transform rotate 0 degrees. And then for my inner one, I also need a rotation on here. So I'm going to say style equals transform rotate negative 0 degrees. And what you'll see when I save that is it actually messes up my positioning because the transform rule that I'm using to rotate this is also what I'm using to translate this. So I need to also set my translation by saying translate negative 50%, negative 50%, and then rotate, and that should put my logo back in position. So essentially, this is what I'm going to need to map over. So I'm going to need to do essentially this, taking into account my image change, my rotation change, and of course my alt tag change for each of these images. So that's what I'm going to do. Let me go ahead and remove my Docker logo, and then I'm going to map over what we have here for our div. So let's take this. Let me see. We have logos.map. So I'm going to say logos.map. And for each of my logos, I'm going to pull out the source, alt, and the rotate value. And I'm going to return essentially the JSX that I already have here. So I'm going to just fold that up so I can copy and paste it very easily inside of my map function. Now, the first thing I need to do is make sure I have a key for this map. So I'm going to say key equals alt, and that should give me the key. For my transformation for the first one, I'm going to need to change this dynamically to a rotation value of whatever that rotate value is. I also want to dynamically change this to a negative rotation value. So I'm going to say negative rotate degrees. And then for my source, I'm going to dynamically change it as well as my alt tag. And if we've done this correctly, as soon as we save this, what we should see is all of our logos in the right positions. Now that we don't need these outlines anymore, let me go ahead and remove the outlines from these divs to clean this up a little bit and save this one more time and see if these logos are all in the position they should be in. And it does look like they are. The only difference that I'm seeing between my design and what I have here is that we also have a background on our inner div to make sure that our orbit doesn't show through. So I can say BG gray 950 on my inner div to make sure that my orbit isn't showing behind my logo. So at this point, we have everything lined up. All we really need to do now is ensure that we have the proper gap and that we're putting everything in the right position. And how we'll do that is we're actually going to add a grid around our content so that when we get to the large size, we can say that the columns is 2 and that we can put them side by side. So around our content, I'm going to create a div. We're going to give this a class name of grid. And we'll just say grid calls 1 because, of course, at the small size, we are going to be having a 1-column grid. And I'm going to go ahead and wrap that around all of my content. And then I need to split up my content into 2 columns. So the first column is going to be all of my content that is not my figure. So that's going to be this one right here. So I'm going to say ending div there. My second column is going to be all the content that is my figure. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap all of that in an ending div as well. As soon as I save that, doesn't look like anything has changed yet, but of course that's because I need to go ahead and add my gap here as well. So I'm going to say gap 20, and that should push my content down from my other column down by that 80 pixel space. Now, the second grid is also going to have a class name on it as well. So we'll make that say flex justify center. And what that will do is make sure that the content of that second column is aligned towards the center instead of being aligned towards the left, which definitely looks better at this size. So let's go ahead and pull over our design on top of our current code and see if there's anything that is misaligned in our design. And it looks like there might be a little bit of a change in the line height of our title that might be messing everything up here. So if we add the letting tight class onto here, we should see everything pop into alignment. And I am seeing that everything looks like it is well aligned at the mobile size now, which means that I can pull my reference image back out to side by side and come into my tablet view and see what we need to change at that size. As I come into my tablet view, I can see that one of the things that we're doing is we're adding a little bit more padding on the left and right of this size. It doesn't look like there's too many other changes though. Oh, and we are making this orbit a little bit bigger as well as the images themselves. So we'll need to account for both of those changes at the tablet size. Let me go ahead and pull my code out a little bit more and see what changes we can make in our code to make this happen. In order to give ourselves more padding on the left and right, let's go ahead and add a class name to our section content and say, at the medium size, we'll say px20 to give ourselves 80 pixels of padding left and right. And let's see what that looks like. That definitely looks a little bit better. We're also bringing up our title font size. So let's say at the medium size, text 4XL should be the right font size here. And that does look like it matches. And then down in our orbit, of course, we're going to want to change this as well to be a little bit bigger. So at the medium size, we'll give a medium modifier and say size 450 pixels. And that will make this bigger. And then for our internal orbit, we'll go ahead and give that a medium modifier as well and say size 300 pixels. And let's see if that looks a lot more close to our design, which it definitely does. Of course, the other change is that all of our images are also a little bit bigger as well. So let's go ahead and change those as well. So at the medium size, these become size 9. And our boxes also change as well. So those were size 10 at the medium size. Those become size 14, which makes those boxes a little bit bigger to accommodate the larger images. Now that we have those responsive sizing's taken care of, let's go ahead and overlay our reference image one more time on top of this view and see if this looks good. And it looks like it does, which means our tablet view should be good. Let's take a look at our desktop view and pull that reference image back out and go ahead and look at our desktop view. Now I want to pull my reference image out side by side just so I can see what's going on with my reference image versus what I have. Let me go ahead and pull out my browser so I can get a better look. And it looks like at this size, we do have a couple things changing. The padding is increasing a little bit more. The title size is coming up. And then of course, at this side, we also have our columns showing side by side. So we'll want to make all of those adjustments inside of our code as well. The first thing we'll start with is our padding left and right. So that's going to be up here at the top. We're going to give this a large modifier and say px40, and that should give us the right padding left and right. We also want to make sure at this large size that we have two columns. So I'm going to say large grid calls 2. And even though we don't have quite enough space down here, we do want to make sure that this doesn't shrink. So we'll say flex justify center, and we'll say flex shrink 0 to ensure that we don't have any kind of shrinkage. Or maybe we need to add this over here. So let me try that with flex shrink 0 and see if that takes care of that problem, which it looks like it does. So I can remove that class that is no longer needed and go ahead and pull this back out, and let's see if we are aligned with our design. Everything looks aligned. Of course, we won't be able to tell until we overlay our reference image. Let me do that one more time to see. And I think we still have our title size that we need to change. So let me go ahead and pull that back out and make that update. And then we'll go ahead and overlay it again and see if we've taken care of our problem. So let's see text 3XL. At the medium size, we go up to text 4XL. And at the large size, we'll just say text 5XL. And that should increase our font size by the right amount at the desktop or laptop size. So let me look at this one more time with it overlaid, and now we have a pixel perfect full size laptop size screen. So this is looking great. That means we need to take care of one thing, which is basically just to remove our padding bottom, remove that class, and then just double check. I'm going to pull out my browser all the way and go through each of my sizes and ensure that everything looks aligned to the design. So everything is looking good all the way through, which now means it's time to move on to the next section. That's all we have time for this video, but make sure you subscribe to this channel so that you know when the next part of this video series is released. In the meantime, here's another great video tutorial to watch, and I'll see you in the next video.